Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1: The Watcher in the Dark. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a sterile glow over the aisles of the convenience store. I stood behind the counter, my fingers drumming against the register, trying to shake off the fatigue that came with the territory of the night shift. It was the quiet hours, the time when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, and the only company I had was the ticking clock and the faint hum of the cooler at my back. Every hour, like clockwork, the front door creaked open, and he came in. He wasn't a regular in the way that most customers were. He was more like a shadow, slipping inside and moving to the far end of the store. He never bought anything. Instead, he would linger, his eyes scanning the shelves as if he were searching for something that wasn't there. I would watch him from my perch behind the counter, a knot tightening in my stomach each time he appeared. His clothes were nondescript, an oversized gray hoodie and faded jeans, and his face was mostly obscured by the hood pulled low. I had never seen his eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me, a subtle weight pressing against my skin. I wasn't sure what to think at first. Was he just an odd customer? Someone with nothing better to do than to haunt the aisles of a small convenience store in the dead of night? But as the hours passed and he continued to return, a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It was on that particular night, a Thursday, that I felt the tension in the air shift. The shop was quieter than usual, the occasional rattle of the front door the only sound breaking the silence. I was flipping through a magazine, trying to distract myself when I heard it, the soft chime of the bell above the door. I looked up, heart racing, and there he was again. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I felt a chill skitter down my spine. He stood just inside the entrance, surveying the store like a predator sizing up its prey. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the floor tiles as I shuffled my feet behind the counter. He moved through the aisles, his presence palpable even from a distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was more than just his routine of observation. It was the way he seemed to exist in that liminal space between being a customer and something much more sinister. I tried not to stare, but my eyes betrayed me, glancing over every few moments to see what he was doing. He picked up a pack of gum, tossed it back onto the shelf, and stood for a while, looking toward me. Time crawled forward. Minutes felt like hours. As I watched him linger, I began to notice the details, the way his fingers twitched at his sides, the way he seemed to breathe in sync with the hum of the refrigeration units. Then, just as abruptly as he arrived, he swept back toward the entrance, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty store. The bell chimed again as he stepped outside, and I released a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I turned to the clock. It was only a few minutes past 11. I had another hour before my shift ended, and I felt the weight of those minutes stretch before me like an endless road. He returned every hour on the hour, always the same routine, always with that inscrutable gaze. I wondered if he had watched as I left for work, marking the days on some invisible calendar, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to push the thought away, but the lingering feeling of dread wrapped tightly around my chest, constricting my breath. Around midnight, the night took on an unsettling stillness. The outside world faded into a blanket of darkness, and the street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I could see him out there, standing just beyond the glass doors, leaning against the wall, his hood pulled further over his face. I was sure he was there to observe me, his intentions hidden beneath layers of ambiguity. Each time he returned, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I could no longer pretend the uneasiness was a figment of my imagination. The way he stood, so still, like a statue watching over its realm, sent a tremor of fear coursing through me. How long had he been doing this? How long had he been tracking me? The clock struck 1, and with it came the chime of the door. He glided inside, his movements almost fluid. I stood frozen behind the counter, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. He wandered the aisles, as always, but this time he didn't check his watch or glance at the shelves. He was watching me. I could feel it. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up in the dim store. I should call someone, my manager, the police, but something stopped me. What would I say? There's a man who keeps coming in and staring at me? It sounded ridiculous. Instead, I focused my attention on the register, pretending to tidy up, my hands shaking as I pushed buttons and rearranged receipts. He didn't move toward the exit this time. Instead, he lingered just outside the light, half covered by the shadows cast by the flickering lights. And then he turned, his back to me, staring out into the dark street. I could see his silhouette growing darker, more imposing, as if he were absorbing the night around him. As the minutes dragged on, the terror coiled tighter around my throat. I knew I had to close up soon. I had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. My mind raced with possibilities. What would he do if he followed me home? What if he was waiting for the moment I locked up alone? The bell chimed again, signaling the arrival of another hour. I didn't look up this time. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the clock, counting down the minutes until I could escape this nightmare. The store felt smaller, the air thicker, as I tried to breathe normally, to appear calm when inside I was anything but. And then, just as the clock struck 2, I felt it. A shift in the atmosphere, a whisper of movement behind me. I turned, and all I saw was the empty store, the unyielding silence pressing down. But even with the absence of his shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for the moment when the door would close behind me for the last time. The fluorescent lights flickered as I stood behind the register, the hum of the refrigerator units providing a monotonous soundtrack to my night shift. Midnight had come and gone, each hour blending into the next, the clocks ticking, echoing like a heartbeat in the empty store. This part of town was known for its quietude, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day, but the stillness only made the shadows seem thicker, more alive. I remembered the first night I encountered him. It was just after 9, the usual rush of customers had dwindled, and I was straightening the magazines when I caught sight of him at the far end of the aisle. He stood there, staring at the snack shelves, his brown hair hanging in front of his eyes. Even from that distance, I sensed something off. He didn't seem to notice me, yet I felt his gaze trace the contours of my face, lingering like a ghost. I dismissed it as paranoia, but as the hours wore on and he returned again, I began to feel a prickling sensation at the nape of my neck. He came like clockwork, every hour, observing without a word, a hollow smile etched on his lips that sent chills down my spine. Tonight, he had slipped through the door at 10, but instead of moving towards the snacks, he lingered near the entrance, studying me. I forced myself to keep busy, pretending to organize the candy displays, desperately trying to ignore him. The store was a small, dimly lit space, with aisles cramped with products that were probably past their prime. Every time I glanced up, there he was, an immovable fixture, his presence casting an unsettling pall over the otherwise banal surroundings. As the clock ticked towards 1, he stepped outside, his silhouette framed by the neon light of the open sign. I tried to convince myself it was simply curiosity that drew him back, but the way he lingered in the doorway, tapping his fingers against his thigh, gnawed at my nerves. Just a weirdo, I muttered under my breath, trying to steady my racing heart. But the calm facade was shattered when I caught a series of soft knocks against the glass door. My pulse raced as I turned my head sharply. He was looking in, his eyes wide, reflecting the light in a way that made them gleam like a predator's. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, unsure if I should confront him or simply ignore his presence. The minutes crawled by, my focus waning as I fidgeted with the cashier's drawer. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he was just lonely. But something in the depth of his gaze hinted at an obsession, threading into an unshakable dread that tightened around my chest. At 1:30, I decided it was time to call my friend. I needed to connect with someone, to dispel the lurking shadows haunting my thoughts. Just as I picked up my phone, I noticed him again. This time he had stepped closer, just out of the reach of the light. His body language was telling. It was as if he was waiting for something, biding his time. My heart sank as the realization washed over me. He was waiting for me to close. "Hey, are you busy?" "I really need to talk," I said when my friend picked up, my voice strained. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone shifting to concern. "There's this guy who keeps coming in, and I think he's... I don't know. I think he's been watching me." "What do you mean?" "Like, checking you out. Or more like stalking." "Stalking," I whispered, glancing at the door, half expecting to see him pressing his face against the glass. "He doesn't buy anything. Just stares. And now he's outside, waiting for me to close." The line went silent for a moment. I could almost hear her think. "I'll come by. Text me the address. I can be there in 20. "Thanks," I murmured, relief flooding through me, though it was mingled with trepidation. We ended the call, and I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the clock instead of the oppressive sensations crawling under my skin. As I watched the seconds tick by, I spotted him again, pacing back and forth outside, his movements unnerving in their deliberately casual rhythm. It was almost as if he were testing the boundaries, waiting for the moment I would be alone. My stomach twisted at the thought. Every instinct in me screamed to lock the door and hide, but that would only escalate the situation. The chime of the door interrupted my spiral of thoughts as he stepped back inside. I forced a smile, hoping to project confidence I didn't feel. "Can I help you with something?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on mine. "Just watching," he said, his voice a low rasp that sent chills along my spine. "Right," I said, my heart racing. "Well, you can watch from outside, it's late." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words, before moving back towards the door. I could almost feel the weight of his gaze lingering as he stepped out again. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2. I had never wanted a shift to end more than in that moment. As I waited, an unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if he really was tracking me? The connection between my shifts and his presence began to solidify, each night blurring into the next, each interaction a thread weaving a deeply disturbing tapestry. I glanced at the security cameras, a false sense of security washing over me as I remembered the previous week. I had seen him there, lurking in the grainy footage, his head barely visible as he rounded the corner. It had seemed innocuous back then, but now it loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to envelop me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the rising fear, but it clung to me like a shadow. As the final minutes of my shift dragged on, dread curled tighter around me, knotting my stomach. I glanced at the door, and when I saw him return, my breath hitched. He stood there, framed by the stark light outside, watching me with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. With each passing second, I knew my time was running out. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an incessant hum, their sickly white glow casting sharp shadows that danced eerily across the aisles of snacks and soda. I leaned against the counter, my gaze flitting to the clock. Midnight had come and gone, and I was stuck in this hellish purgatory until 3 a.m. The neon signs flickered, and the occasional hiss of the soda fountain broke the stillness, but they did little to ease the growing sense of dread that clung to me like a damp cloak. It had been 3 weeks since I first noticed him, the man who seemed to materialize out of the darkness every hour on the hour. He was unremarkable, save for his unwavering gaze. Each time he entered, his eyes were fixed on me, assessing and unblinking, as if trying to decipher a puzzle I wasn't even aware I was part of. He never bought anything, never spoke, just stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light, a silhouette of quiet menace. I had tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I was simply overreacting to the creeping loneliness of the night shift. But as the weeks wore on, my initial unease transformed into something colder, something primal. I could feel it in my bones, the way he lingered, the way he watched. It was more than just curiosity, it felt predatory. On this particular night, I felt his presence before he even stepped through the door. The air shifted, charged with something sinister as the clock struck 1. I involuntarily shivered, my skin prickling as I looked up. Sure enough, there he was, his usual cap pulled low over his face, casting shadows that obscured his features. My heart raced as I forced myself to smile, an automatic reflex. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor inside me. He stood there, unflinching, his gaze boring into mine. There was no response, just that unsettling silence hanging heavy between us. Minutes passed, and I felt time stretch like a rubber band, taut and ready to snap. It was in that tension that I realized I was holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, desperate to fill the void with something, anything. I can show you where the chips are," I stammered, gesturing weakly down the aisle. He didn't follow. Instead, he stepped closer, crossing the threshold of the store with an intentionality that set alarm bells ringing in my mind. I had heard horror stories about people disappearing, about lurking dangers in the quietest of places. The thought fluttered in my mind like a moth to a flame, and my stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't let myself get cornered. "Look, if you're not buying anything, I need to get back to work," I said, my voice firmer now, though my insides quaked. But he just tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words, and then he took a step back, retreating to the doorframe once more. I watched, a mix of relief and frustration swirling within me. I had expected him to leave, but he stayed put, an uninvited guest in my already isolated world. I tried to distract myself, counting change, organizing the candy display, anything to keep my mind from wandering down that dark path. Every half hour, I glanced at the clock, willing the passage of time to hurry up. But as soon as 1 o'clock approached, he returned again, just as he had the last few nights. The realization gnawed at me. He was tracking my routine, his presence a quiet but steady threat looming just outside the door. With each subsequent hour, the weight of his gaze grew heavier. At one point, I dared to peek out the window, half expecting him to be gone. But there he was, lingering in the shadows, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the parking lot. I felt a chill race up my spine as I thought about how isolated I was. The store was far from the main road, surrounded by thick woods that swallowed the sounds of the world beyond. 2 o'clock rolled around, and the sensation of dread deepened. I couldn't shake the creeping thought that he was waiting, biding his time. He seemed to know precisely when I was alone, and the idea twisted in my mind like a knife. I grabbed my phone, though there was no one to call. I thought about the police, but what would I even say? There was no crime yet, just a man watching me, gathering his courage, or perhaps something darker. I was pulled from my spiraling thoughts when I heard the jingle of the door chime again. He entered, but this time he didn't stand back. Instead, he stepped deeper into the store, just a few feet away from me, his eyes fixed on mine. The silence shimmered with unspoken intentions, and I could feel a suffocating tension building in the air. "Can I help you?" I asked again, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but he took another step closer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my instincts screaming at me to flee. I backed up against the counter, my mind racing through the options. Should I call for help? Should I confront him? Fear coiled tightly in my stomach, making it hard to think clearly. In a sudden burst of bravery, I grabbed the intercom and pressed the button for the store radio. "Hey, is anyone up there?" I called, my voice echoing in the hollow space. I could use some help. The silence that followed was deafening. My heart pounded, and I realized just how alone I truly was. When I looked back at him, there was a glint in his eye, a predatory interest that made my blood run cold. He took another step forward, and I felt the world tilt around me. I turned and ran for the back room, the trembling in my legs turning to a panicked rush. My breath came fast and shallow, and I knew I had to get away. The back door led to a small alley, but I hesitated, the thought of leaving my post clawing at me. Would he follow me outside? Would he even let me escape? I could feel his presence growing heavier behind me, the door swinging open with a heavy creak. I glanced back, and there he stood, framed in the doorway, a shadow with a chilling grin. My pulse quickened, and I knew I had to act fast. There was no more time for fear. I had to choose. And then, I made my decision. The fluorescent lights hummed a disjointed tune as I wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time. Shadows danced across the tiles, forming unsettling shapes that mirrored the anxiety twisting in my stomach. It was just past midnight, the time when the store felt most vulnerable, yet another hour stretched out in front of me, each minute dragging like molasses. I had become accustomed to the solitude of these late shifts, but tonight felt different, thick with an intangible tension. The door chimed again, marking the arrival of my persistent observer. He stepped inside, his lanky frame swaying slightly, as if caught in an invisible wind. I recognized him immediately, though I still didn't know his name. He had been coming in like clockwork, every hour on the hour, for the past few nights. He never bought anything. He simply wandered the aisles, his eyes trailing over the mundane items as though they contained secrets only he could understand. "Long night, huh?" I tried to sound casual, my voice barely breaking through the silence. He nodded, his gaze fixed on a display of energy drinks. "Yeah, long night," he echoed, though his tone lacked any real engagement. It was unsettling how he spoke, his words oddly detached, almost rehearsed. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the suffocating sensation curling around my chest. As he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass door, a hollow-eyed stare, like he was searching for something that wasn't there. The door swung shut behind him, leaving me with the unsettling feeling that this would not be our last encounter for the night. The minutes crawled by, and I busied myself with restocking shelves, but my mind was not on the job. I couldn't help but think about him, the way he lingered, always choosing the same time to appear. Was he simply another insomniac looking for a way to pass the time? Or was there something darker lurking in his intent? When the clock struck 1, he returned. My heart raced at the sight of him, the way he moved with an eerie grace, as if gliding across the floor. I held my breath, waiting for our exchange. "Can I help you find anything?" I asked. He shook his head but lingered at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixated on me. I felt exposed, as if he were peeling away the layers of my carefully constructed defenses. I studied him. There was something unnerving about his stillness, an intensity that felt like a spotlight focusing on me, but I couldn't decipher what he really wanted. My stomach churned, and I tried to force myself to look away, to focus on the mundane items scattered across the shelves. But with every passing moment, the silence between us grew thicker. At 2 o'clock, he reappeared, and my nerves twisted tighter. This time, he stood outside the store, staring in through the glass. My breath hitched as I caught his reflection in the dim light, a silhouette against the bright convenience store interior. Just watching. I wanted to call out, to ask what he was doing, but fear froze my words in my throat. I could see him clearly now, the way his eyes darted over the items, never focusing on any single thing for more than a moment. It was as if he were waiting for something or someone. The third hour passed, and my thoughts grew frantic. I checked the store's clock repeatedly, hyper-aware of how the hands moved, the minutes ticking by with deliberate malice. The register's beep echoed louder than usual in the silence, each sound a reminder that I was utterly alone, save for my shadowy admirer. At 3 o'clock sharp, he returned, but this time his demeanor shifted. Gone was the detached observer, replaced by a more purposeful air. He leaned against the door frame, the dim lighting casting a stark shadow across his features. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Why do you keep coming back?" I blurted out, my voice unsteady. He stepped inside, letting the door swing closed, and for the first time, he locked eyes with me. "Just watching," he said softly, almost conspiratorially. "Watching what?" "Just you. Your schedule. You're alone here a lot, aren't you?" My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I took a step back, instinctively retreating. "What do you want?" His smile was unsettling, a thin line that barely reached his eyes. "I just want to talk." "But you'll be closing soon, won't you?" Panic surged as the implications of his words sank in. He had been tracking my schedule. I had been foolishly oblivious, thinking he was just another late-night customer. But he was no ordinary customer. He was a predator, and I was the prey. I took another step back, my breath quickening. "I'm going to call the police," I stammered. "Go ahead," he replied, his voice low and steady. "They won't get here in time." The reality of his words crashed over me, leaving me reeling. I needed to escape. I was trapped behind the counter, but the door was just a few feet away. My heart thundered in my chest as I silently weighed my options. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, desperation lacing my tone. "I told you. I'm watching." "Waiting for the right moment," he replied, his eyes glinting with a sinister excitement. In that moment, the store felt like a cage, the walls closing in on me. I glanced toward the door and saw it as my only chance. Gathering every ounce of courage, I lunged for the exit, my heart pounding against my rib cage as adrenaline surged through my veins. As I opened the door, the bell jingled, signaling my frantic escape into the night. The cool air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to quell the fear coursing through me. I turned to look back at the store, my heart racing as I prepared to run. But he was gone. In the shadows cast by the flickering lights, there was no sign of my stalker. I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence lingering in the air, a silent promise that this wasn't over. As I dashed away from the store, I knew I had to get help, but deep down, I felt the weight of dread settle over me. I couldn't escape the feeling that somehow, he would always be watching. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a harsh glare across the aisles of dwindling snacks and empty shelves. It was well past midnight, and the world outside had grown silent, the kind of stillness that pressed against my ears and made each ticking second painfully loud. I pulled my jacket closer around me, every rustle of fabric echoing like a warning in the empty store. Last night, I had seen him again. The strange man who haunted my shifts. He returned every hour, as if the ticking clock controlled him like a puppet on strings. Each time, he'd enter, hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes scanning the aisles, lingering on me longer than was comfortable. At first, I thought he might be lost or perhaps just bored. It was a small town, and the late-night crowd was usually thin. But as the hours passed, unease crept under my skin like a chill, and I started to believe that this wasn't mere coincidence. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the rhythmic silence. A text from Emily, wishing me luck on my shift and reminding me to lock the doors when I closed. My stomach twisted at the thought of locking up alone. It was just a convenience store, yet the creeping shadows outside made it feel like a tomb. The clock ticked past 1 a.m. I could feel that heavy weight of anticipation settle in my bones. He'd be back soon. My heart raced as I glanced toward the glass doors, expecting to see him lurking in the darkness. I busied myself behind the counter, arranging the candy bars just to have something to do. Then, the door chime rang, and he stepped in. The man wore the same weathered jacket and a hat pulled low over his forehead. He didn't approach the register. Instead, he drifted through the aisles, his movements deliberate and slow. I tried to focus on the magazine in front of me, but every glance up revealed him, his gaze fixated on me, analyzing me like I was a specimen under a microscope. "Can I help you?" I finally managed to say, my voice a fragile thread. He paused, his head tilting slightly, yet he didn't answer. Instead, he continued his exploration of the store, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was as if he was cataloging every section, every product. I could feel the weight of his stare even when he wasn't looking directly at me. My instinct screamed for me to press the panic button hidden beneath the counter, but I hesitated. What if it turned out to be nothing, just an overreaction to a man being oddly peculiar? A minute stretched into eternity. He eventually ambled toward the exit, but not before his eyes caught mine again, and I felt a flutter of dread in my chest. The door chimed again, and just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the blackness of the night. My gaze fell back to the clock. The minute hand moved, marking the seconds until my shift would finally end. The store felt emptier than before, the silence now a suffocating blanket. Thoughts plagued me about his intentions. I couldn't shake the feeling he was mapping my life, learning my routine, waiting for that perfect moment. Hours passed in a haze of anxious glances toward the door, every sound sending my heart into a frenzy. The man didn't return, but I felt his presence linger, an omen of what was to come. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the magazine, but the articles blurred together. Time dragged on, and when the clock finally struck 3, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was close to closing. But then I heard a rustle outside, the soft crunch of gravel beneath shoes. My breath caught in my throat. I peeked through the glass doors, half expecting to see him standing there, lurking like a phantom. Instead, there was nothing but the night's emptiness. Adrenaline coursed through me, and I forced myself to shake it off. I had to get through this shift. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. I gathered my belongings, starting to the door as I prepared to turn off the lights. That's when I spotted him again. He was lingering just beyond the glass, hidden in the shadows, his features obscured. My heart raced as I realized he was watching me intently, waiting for me to close up, for the moment when I'd be vulnerable. The realization crashed down on me like a wave. He had been tracking me, waiting for his opportunity. Panic gripped me, and I fought the urge to flee. I had to stay calm, to think clearly. I flipped the lights off, leaving only the dim emergency exit sign to guide my way. I couldn't let him know I was scared. I locked the register, counting the seconds until I could escape. But as I turned toward the door, ready to bolt out into the night, I heard a soft knock. My breath hitched as I froze, eyes wide, staring into the darkness. "Let me in," a gravelly voice called out from behind the glass. I didn't move. "I just want to talk." The sound sent ice shooting through my veins. He was here. He was waiting. "You don't have to be afraid," he continued, his tone unsettlingly calm. "I just want to talk. We can be friends." I backed away from the door, heart pounding against my ribs. It was nearly 4 a.m., and the bleakness of the night loomed outside like a predator waiting for its prey. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling, but I knew I had to act quickly. My mind raced with possibilities. "Stay away from me," I shouted, but the words felt weak, muffled by the distance. He leaned closer to the glass, his shadow stretching, the low light illuminating just enough of his face to flash a chilling grin. "I know your name, Rachel. I've seen you here many times. I just want to be friends." Each word sent tremors through me, and I felt trapped in that small store, every door a prison. My fingers found the panic button, and I pressed it hard. The sound of sirens echoed in my ears, but deep down, I knew one thing: he wasn't going to wait for help to arrive. I darted to the back of the store, my heart racing as I heard the soft jingle of the bell above the door. He had entered. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I needed to hide, to get away. The shelves loomed around me like silent witnesses as I crouched down behind them, praying he wouldn't find me. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement, my heart pounding louder than any siren. Story 2, the knock at my door. I never used to be afraid of living alone. In fact, after years of sharing cramped apartments with college roommates and then a noisy partner who insisted the television had to be on every waking hour, I relished the silence of my little flat. It was the kind of quiet that let me read for hours without interruption, cook at my own pace, and drift off at night with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company. The building was old, one of those tired blocks of flats that looked drab on the outside but had been refurbished enough inside to make them comfortable. My unit was on the 3rd floor, tucked at the end of the corridor. Only one neighbor shared my landing, an elderly man who kept to himself and smelled faintly of tobacco whenever we passed in the hall. It was early spring, a time when the air outside still held its chill, but the days had begun to stretch. I remember those first evenings where I'd sit by the window with the lamp off, just watching the daylight fade over the car park. The world felt safe in its routines, people coming home from work, children kicking a ball before supper, the occasional dog walker trailing a muddy Labrador. If I'm honest, I felt a little smug about my independence. 30 years old, single, paying my own rent and answering to no one. It was a quiet, orderly life. The first odd thing was small enough that I nearly forgot it as soon as it happened. A knock at the door around 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. 3 taps, light, quick, almost hesitant. I'd been reading at the kitchen table and assumed it must be Mr. Ellis, the neighbor, perhaps needing help with his bins. But when I opened the door, the corridor was empty. Just a faded carpet stretching to the stairwell, lit by the flickering strip light that always buzzed faintly. I remember calling out, "Hello?" my voice bouncing strangely off the narrow walls. Nothing. A few seconds later I closed the door, half amused, half unsettled, and went back to my book. Probably some kids knocking and running. But the knocks came again the next night. This time later, closer to 11. I didn't get up straight away. I sat frozen with the television murmuring in front of me, ears straining. 3 knocks again, identical rhythm. It was the consistency of it that prickled at me, like whoever was doing it wanted to be recognized. When I finally went to the door, I hesitated before unlocking it. Instead, I pressed my eye to the peephole, expecting maybe to catch a glimpse of some teenage prankster scampering down the hall. But there was no one there. The corridor was deserted. And yet, there was a darkness just to the right of my vision. Not a person exactly, not a shape I could define, but a presence where the hallway light should have revealed only bare wall. I leaned closer, squinting, until my breath fogged the lens. That was when I realized what I was seeing, a shadow, pressed flat against the wall beside my door frame, just out of sight of the peephole. My stomach dropped. Someone was standing there deliberately hiding, inches from where my face hovered on the other side of the wood. I jumped back, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed not to open the door. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, phone in hand, debating whether I was overreacting. It could have been a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I'd imagined the outline. My hand shook too much to call anyone. Eventually, after several long minutes, I crept back to the peephole. The corridor was empty. No shadow, no sound of footsteps retreating. Just silence. I slept badly that night, startling awake at every creak of the building. The next morning I told myself I had dreamt half of it. Exhaustion does strange things to the mind. I tried to push it from my thoughts, though the memory lingered like a bruise. That evening, when I came home from work, I noticed something else. A smudge on the doorframe, just at shoulder height. At first I thought it was dirt, but when I leaned closer it looked like the faint mark of a hand, fingers splayed, greasy against the paint. I scrubbed it off with a damp cloth, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. For the rest of the week I lived in a strange state of alertness. Every time I walked down the corridor toward my flat, I glanced over my shoulder. Every time I heard footsteps echo on the stairs, my pulse quickened. The knocks didn't come again right away, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stopped sitting with the lights off in the evenings. I started checking the locks 2, 3, sometimes 4 times before bed. And then, on Saturday, just as I was settling with a glass of wine and a film, the knocks returned. 3 taps. Same rhythm. My skin went cold. This time I didn't move. I didn't dare look through the peephole. I sat frozen on the sofa, hardly breathing, until the sound came again, 3 soft knocks, patient, deliberate. Whoever was out there wanted me to know they hadn't gone away. I didn't move for nearly an hour after those knocks on Saturday night. The wine in my glass went warm, the film kept playing, but I couldn't take in a single frame. My eyes kept strained to the front door as if the wood itself might pulse or crack. When I finally gathered the courage to approach, I didn't dare look through the peephole. Instead, I placed my ear against the door and listened. The corridor was silent, save for the faint hum of the strip light. No footsteps, no movement. Still, it took every ounce of will to slide the chain into place and double-check the bolt before retreating to my bedroom. That night was worse than the one before. Every creak of the pipes, every gust that rattled the window felt deliberate. I woke up drenched in sweat around 3 a.m. to what I thought was another knock, but when I stumbled into the living room and listened, there was only silence. I remember standing there in the dark, heart pounding, realizing I was gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought with me without even thinking. That scared me almost as much as the knocking itself, how quickly I had slipped into paranoia. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I went out for groceries, said good morning to Mr. Ellis when he shuffled past me in the stairwell. He looked at me oddly, maybe noticing my pale face or the way I gripped my keys tight between my fingers. I considered asking him if he'd heard anything unusual during the week, but stopped myself. What would I even say? Have you noticed someone knocking on my door and hiding just out of sight? It sounded ridiculous. By Sunday evening, I convinced myself I was overreacting. People live with far worse actual break-ins, actual danger. This was just weird knocks. Maybe kids from another floor playing games. Maybe someone drunk pressing the wrong door. My imagination had filled in the rest. So when it happened again, I almost felt a sick kind of vindication. 10:30 at night, 3 quick taps. My whole body tensed, but I forced myself to move. This time I went to the door deliberately, determined to prove there was nothing there. Slowly, I bent to the peephole. Empty corridor. But then, like before, I saw it. That sliver of darkness, flat against the wall to the right. A person pressed there, so close I could almost hear the faint rustle of fabric if I held my breath. They knew exactly where to stand to avoid the peephole's curve of vision. A shiver went through me so sharp it made my teeth ache. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching the nothingness where I knew someone was hiding, until finally my nerves gave out. I backed away, locked myself in the bedroom, and left the television blaring to drown the silence. The following morning I checked the corridor before leaving for work. Nothing. No marks on the doorframe this time. The ordinary stillness of a Monday morning almost convinced me again that it had all been in my head. But then, when I reached the stairwell, I glanced back. On the wall opposite my flat, at eye level, someone had scratched a mark into the paint. 3 short lines, parallel, like tally marks. I froze. My breath fogged in the cool hallway. The scratches were fresh, flakes of paint still clung to the edges. Whoever had been knocking, they wanted me to know they were real. That week stretched unbearably. The knocks didn't come every night, but often enough that I stopped feeling safe in my own home. Tuesday passed without incident, and I allowed myself to relax slightly, only for the sound to return Wednesday at midnight. Again, 3 knocks, patient, deliberate. Each time I refused to look through the peephole, but my imagination conjured the shadow crouched out of sight, waiting. By Friday I was afraid. I jumped in my own reflection in the microwave door, startled when the phone rang, kept every light in the flat blazing even at 2 in the morning. I began rehearsing explanations for the landlord, the police, anyone who might take me seriously. But what did I really have? Strange knocks. Shadows. Scratches on paint. It sounded thin even in my own head. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard something new. Not a knock. A faint scrape. Like fingertips trailing slowly down wood. My blood ran cold. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, softer this time, as if whoever was outside was tracing the outline of my door with a nail. I stayed frozen until dawn, the scrape echoing in my skull long after it had stopped. The next morning, I found another smudge on the paint. A fingertip mark this time, just beside the handle. I told myself I would go to the police. I said it out loud in the kitchen while rinsing a glass, as if the act of saying it would steady me. I pictured a calm uniformed officer taking notes, the predictable bureaucratic comfort of a report filed and stamped. But every version of that conversation I rehearsed in the mirror ended with the same hollow feeling. What did I actually have? Vague knocks, a few handprints I could scrub away, a pair of tally marks carved into the stairwell paint. Not enough to make the system move. Still, the marks and noises had eroded something inside me, not just my sense of safety but my faith in small, ordinary certainties. The kettle had become an instrument of terror. A hiss in the early evening meant someone could be at the door, waiting for me to lower my guard. The hum of the radiator sounded suddenly like a voice on the other side of a wall. I began to watch the sky through the window at odd hours, imagining headlights pooling at the bottom of the car park and a figure tracing my path up the stairs. When I finally did call the police, the young officer who answered my call came across as sympathetic in a textbook way, slow nods, neutral patience, the kind of face that had been taught not to alarm. He took my details, asked me to describe the knocks. I felt ridiculous giving the cadence 3 little taps, like someone knocking politely, then the silence. He put me on hold for a long time and I heard the muffled movements of radio traffic before he returned. "We'll send someone round to check the building next time there's a patrol nearby," he said. "If anyone is acting suspiciously, call us immediately. Lock the doors, don't confront them." He left me with a list of sensible instructions I had already been following. The words were not consoling. They were procedures, and procedures assumed a rational universe in which patterns could be interrupted by actions. This problem felt like a private geometry of menace. It did not bend to procedure. After that, I installed a chain I could fasten from the inside and a simple door jammer I'd seen on a home security advert. They looked absurdly small and domestic against the solidity I wanted them to represent. When I tested them, the door held like any door should, and I felt a brief, ridiculous surge of confidence. I told myself that was enough. I told myself I had taken control. For 2 nights it seemed to be enough. Then a parcel arrived. I had ordered nothing. The box was cheap corrugated cardboard, the kind that folded in giveaway creases, and it had no return address. My name was written in block capitals with a black marker. The ink bled slightly into the cardboard as if the hand that wrote it had been irritated or hurried. I set it on the kitchen counter and turned it over several times, feeling the weight. Nothing bulky, nothing dangerous. The tape on the seams had been cut cleanly with a blade. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, was a single, ordinary item, a small ceramic salt shaker, the kind you bought in tourist shops with a painted lighthouse or a garish flower. It was unremarkable, ridiculous almost, if it hadn't been for the way it sat in my hand like a deliberate gift. On the base, someone had scratched a date, the day the knocks had begun. 3 parallel marks had been etched into the porcelain. I remember the way my hands tightened until the ceramic cracked against my palm. The kettle hissed. The building creaked. I wanted to throw the shaker away, burn it, call someone to come and pick it up, but the absurdity of the object insisted I photograph it. I took a picture and sent it to my friend Danny with one sentence: "Someone is messing with me." She answered within minutes with a string of concerned messages and, eventually, with more practical advice. "Change the locks," she wrote. "Install a camera. Sleep at my place." She sent 2 phone calls that I ignored because I did not want someone else's voice in my flat past midnight. I appreciated her practical anger, the way it boiled into solutions, but none of it erased the image of a person standing in the shadow of my stairwell merging with the paint. I bought a cheap door camera online, a Ring-style gadget that fitted over the peephole and recorded even in dim light. It was a clumsy thing to install with my screwdriver, the screws scratching the wood, the plastic faceplate snapping into place with a sound that made my skin prickle. For the first few days it recorded nothing meaningful: empty corridors, the creak of the stairwell, the elderly man shuffling by once a morning. Then, 3 nights after the parcel, the footage captured something that made me sick. It was brief, less than 7 seconds, and grainy, shot in the poor yellow light of the corridor. I watched it 10 times until I had the grain memorized. A human figure approached my door, slow and careful, as if weighing every movement. The camera's angle cut off the face. Every attempt to identify the person failed because they kept their head tilted away or the frame trimmed it. What the footage did show was one hand, pressed against the wall beside the door handle, the fingers splayed. The wrist was wrapped in a dark sleeve. The hand hovered there, then tapped 3 polite taps and then rested flat against the paint. For a breath it was still. Then it moved away. My first instinct was to call the police again, this time with evidence. The officer took down the details and promised to dispatch someone to search the building immediately. I watched their taillights slip away down the road and felt foolish when nothing happened. The patrol came and went, a perfunctory drive through the estate. They found no one. CCTV from the stairwell showed only an empty patch of wall. That afternoon, I found another mark, this time not on the door frame but on the windowsill overlooking the car park. A smear of dirt, an outline as if a hand had rested there while someone peered in. The thought that they had been watching me while I walked around my own flat made bile rise in my throat. I called Danny and asked which was worse, the knowing or the not knowing. She cursed and said, "Both." Real helpful. Then, one evening as rain turned the world outside into a smear of light and shadow, I came home to find the chain unlatched. I remember the exact pattern of the rain, the sound of it on the roof like fingers drumming. The building smelled of wet concrete and frying oil. The corridor light was on, a dull buzz. My key turned in the lock, slow, and when I pushed the door inward the chain jingled. It was not latched. I had left it secure that morning. My stomach folded in on itself. I did not step inside at first. I held the door open with one hand and peered inside as if someone might jump on me from the darkness. The flat looked unchanged, 2 mugs in the sink, a scatter of paper on the desk where I'd left it. But there was a smell, slight, chemical, sharp like the afterscent of someone who has been inside a small, enclosed space. I looked down and my heart lodged in my throat. On the doormat, someone had scrawled in the kind of wet dirt that could be wiped away but had been left deliberately, 3 short, parallel lines. I was no longer certain which I feared more, the trespass itself or the knowledge that someone had stood on my mat and left a mark as if to say, I was here. I could be here. I called the police from the street this time, my voice a taut wire, each syllable a little frantic. They came faster. They took photographs, measured footprints in the damp with the kind of clinical precision that felt obscene in the face of my private terror. They asked me if I wanted to stay with a friend. I thought of Danny's couch, of the faint smell of her shampoo and the safety of a house with 2 dogs that would bark inconsolably at a stranger. I almost agreed, then thought of the work piling up, the cat at the shelter I was volunteering in on Saturday, the absurd logistics of a life left for a night. I slept poorly that night, but in a small, sharp way, on edge, yes, but with a plan. I would install additional locks, change the chain for a door bar, and set the camera to record continuously. I had been reactive for too long. I would be proactive now. I told myself as I lay awake that action was the antidote. But the action did not diminish the creeping certainty that the other person had not been clumsy or random, that this was someone who liked being noticed and liked the effect their noticing had on me. The next morning, when I checked the footage, the camera had recorded nothing between 3 and 4 a.m. The device used 3 little blinks to indicate a low battery, a cruel irony. The memory card, when I checked it in the light of day, had a gap, hours of static where the file should have been. I went back through the footage until my eyes burned, until I caught the faintest distortion at the margins at approximately 3:17 a.m., a smear of pixels that suggested movement too quick to be captured properly. I enlarged the frame until the grain became noise, and the noise a kind of torment. Someone had been in my flat. Not long, not obvious, hardly anything changed, but the gap in the recording, the unlatched chain, the dirty smear on the doormat, they added up into a simple arithmetic entry. And with that, the geometry of menace shifted from being outside to being possible, on principle, inside. I slept that night on Danny's couch. When I returned the following day to collect a few necessities, I found a note tucked beneath the salt shaker, single, thin, folded paper with 1 sentence written in neat block capitals. I know where you are. It was a line so blunt and absolute it felt like an ultimatum. My stomach turned, and for the first time I tasted a fear that had nothing to do with imagination. This was not a game. This was a map being drawn, and I had just been placed at its center. That note folded into a single, terrible sentence had the gravity of a verdict. I held it in both hands on my kitchen table and felt the world simplify into the small rectangle of paper and the house around it. I did not immediately call the police. I stared at the words until they blurred, as if by looking hard enough I could push the message back into anonymity. Instead, I did the only thing that felt possible. I cataloged. I made a list of what had happened and when knocks, scratches, the parcel, the gaps in the footage, the unlatched chain. I dated each item, wrote down the precise time I remembered, and set the sheet of paper aside as if the act of writing could contain the danger in ink. Danny drove me back that afternoon with 2 duffel bags and a kettle that whistled more solidly than my confidence felt. She refused to come into the flat, standing in the stairwell while I grabbed a toothbrush and a cardigan. "Change your locks," she said again, as if repeating a spell might make it true. "And for God's sake, bring the salt shaker and the note." Evidence. I did. Part of me wanted the police to seal the place like a crime scene. Part of me wanted to burn every scrap and never see the building again. When I returned alone that evening, the flat felt different in the dark, too large, echoing, the ordinary items arranged with suspicious intent. I locked the door and checked the chain despite knowing it was useless ceremony. I took up the little door bar and tried to fit it under the handle. It bumped my ankle and clattered to the floor. I set it in place, more for the illusion of preparation than for any genuine expectation it would stop someone who had already been inside. I started sleeping in the living room, lights on, phone charged and under my pillow. I put chairs under the doorknob because it felt better than nothing. I moved the couch so that it faced the door, like a defensive position, and slept with the laptop up in case I needed to wake at a video. I learned the precise sound of my apartment, the refrigerator's distant thrum, a radiator sighing, the slow tick of the clock on the mantle. Every new hum was a foreign noise. 3 nights passed with nothing. The police had taken a report, had walked the corridor, had left handouts about domestic security. They were people who had seen worse and therefore saw less of the private terror I lived in. I began to gather the threads together into small, practical attempts at control. A locksmith came and changed the locks, a man with calloused hands who looked at me with a blunt sympathy and did the job in 10 minutes. The new cylinder cost more than I wanted to spend, but it turned with a smooth, decisive motion that felt like a promise. The second morning after the locksmith, I found a Polaroid shoved under my door. It was face down and cold. My hands trembled when I picked it up. On the back, in the same neat capitals, was a single word, sleep. The image itself, when I turned it over with my thumb, showed the corner of my living room, the coffee table, the lamp, the floral cushion I had on the sofa. The angle was close to the floor. Whoever had taken it had been inside my flat and had photographed the room as if taking a catalog of my life. Right then, all the small attempts at security felt laughably insufficient. The locks, the cameras, the chairs under the door. I called Danny and told her. She insisted I stay with her for as long as I wanted. I said I needed to pick up a few things. I wanted to face the place, to see the things again and tell myself they were ordinary objects, that the Polaroid could be a prank, that someone could have taken a picture through the window. But the Polaroid had been taken from inside. The corners of the frame caught the grain of my rug. The cushion had a stray thread that I could point to and say, "See? That's mine." When I examined the photo, there was, tucked under the leg of the coffee table, a small rectangle of paper. My heart hammered at the thought that the person's camera had been precise enough to notice the detail I had not. The police arranged for someone to take fingerprints from the salt shaker and the Polaroid. I sat rigid in the kitchen as they worked, watching gloved hands inspect the grain of the wood and the smudge on the window. "We'll do what we can," one officer said. "If this person is local, there's a chance we'll pick up something." His voice was steady, trained, and yet his eyes flicked to the open hallway exactly the way anyone's would when they smelled danger. He did not say the thing I wanted to hear most, that whoever had done this could not come back. No one could say that and mean it. After they left, I found another item on the stairs. A key. Not a house key, but a single, old-fashioned brass key, scuffed and heavy. Someone had laid it on the 3rd step, balanced as if deliberately placed for me to see. My stomach climbed into my throat. I picked it up and turned it in my hand. There was no tag, no number, nothing that meant anything. I took it to the window and held it up against the light and imagined every possible door it could fit into. In a strange fit of defiance, I walked the building at dusk and tried the key indoors, the boiler room, the downstairs storage closet, the laundry room. It fit none. Each rejected attempt made my heart race anew. The next day, an elderly woman from the next block down stopped me in the grocer's and asked in a conspiratorial whisper if I had been bothered by noises. She said her sister had moved out of the building years ago after a man had followed her and left things on the stairs. "You must be careful," she said. "Never assume your house keeps you safe." Her words pried open a new hole of dread. If this had happened before, then maybe the person knew the building, knew how to work quietly, knew where to hide. I began to watch my own habits like another person would. I canceled 2 afternoon meetings because the thought of being away and returning to a note felt unbearable. I learned to check behind the curtains when I came home. I began to carry a torch in my bag and a small hammer in the glove compartment of my car, petty weapons that felt ridiculous and yet offered the illusion of agency. Then, one night at midnight, the knock was not on the door. It was on my bedroom window. I had slept with it cracked for fresh air and woke to the pressure of something against the glass. 3 light taps from outside, a cautious sound as if someone was testing. The window overlooked the small courtyard where people stored bikes. There was a slender strip of night visible, a smear of sky. I moved without thinking, pulled up the blind, and in the sliver of light I saw a shadow pass across the courtyard and merge with the dark. The sound came again, 3 taps. I could feel the vibration along the frame, a small, intimate contact, like a hand seeking permission. I called the police from the window, breathless. They said they would send units. I stayed at the window until I was dizzy, watching nothing and everything at once. The taps stopped as soon as the idea of help was real. The officers arrived 20 minutes later and walked through the courtyard with flashlights until their beams cut through puddles of oily water. They found a ladder propped under the fire escape, its feet scuffed and wet. The ladder had been left there recently, the rubber tips not yet stiff with grime. Probably teenagers, one officer said, and I wanted to throw something at his calmness. I went to bed with the curtains sewn shut in my imagination, the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞. Outside, someone had been close enough to press their fingers to my window. The intimacy of that thought made me physically ill. For the first time, I could no longer claim that the danger was external. The line had been crossed. The geometry of menace had become a shape with an interior. When I woke the next morning, my phone had a text message from an unknown number. It was a single word, typed in the same block capitals I had come to recognize. Look. I did not go to work that day. I sat on the couch and listened to the owls breathe. Every time the radiator clicked or the kettle hissed, I thought, with a small, feral certainty, that someone else had been there only hours before. I had hoped to force some resolution, to catch the person, to find a face to name the fear. Instead, the only thing I found was the knowledge that they had been patient, methodical, and frighteningly intimate with the spaces I called mine. As evening came on, I resolved to stay awake and watch. I placed the Polaroid face down on the coffee table and slept in a chair with the lamp on. I knew in my bones that the person would not be reckless. If they wanted me to know they were close, they would send me exactly the kind of message I had received. They had already proven a talent for timing. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed another message. This one contained a single photograph. It showed the inside of the wardrobe in my bedroom. I could see the hangers, my coat with the lining turned out, the small pair of boots I kept on the floor. The image was taken from a low angle, almost as if the person crouched in the corner of the room while taking it. A chill rose from my stomach to my throat. The photo's timestamp was 2 minutes previous. I put the phone down and considered every possible way to explode that flattened to sound alarms, shouting, anything to drive the presence into the open. Instead I felt, with a clarity that was new and terrible, the crush of being watched from inside my own house. I was no longer the subject of a series of pranks. I was under surveillance, inside my private life, reduced to a thing to be observed. I went to the wardrobe slowly and opened it. There was nothing inside but my clothes. The hangers were still, the boots where I had left them. But on the middle shelf, folded neatly as if arranged by someone who had learned the shape of my things, sat a small square of photograph paper. On it, a single image, me, asleep in the chair, head slumped forward, the lamp on, the Polaroid face down on the table. The image was taken from the doorway of my flat. I slid back against the wardrobe and felt the room tilt. The person had photographed me while I slept. That night I could not tell where the fear ended and the shame began, that private embarrassment that someone had watched the way I slept, catalogued the small habits I had never meant to share. I realized, with a cold, measuring clarity, that the problem could not be solved simply by moving furniture or changing locks. The person who had chosen me had been patient, practiced, and close enough to touch the outlines of my life. The options thinned: run, confront, publish everything, or wait. And the thing that made my hands go numb was the simple arithmetic of time. Sooner or later, I would have to choose. I wish I could tell you that I did something brave that final night, that I fought back, called the police in time, or even ran. The truth is far worse, because by then, I was worn down to nothing but nerves and exhaustion. Living alone had always felt empowering, proof that I could manage myself, but in those last days the flat became a prison, and every dark corner seemed to breathe with anticipation. The knocks came earlier than usual, just after 9. 3 soft raps, followed by silence. My heart thumped so hard I thought I might faint. I sat frozen on the sofa, my phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But I didn't press it. Some irrational part of me was terrified that if I called, if I broke the silence, I provoked them into doing something worse. The people tempted me like a dare. I forced myself to get up, every step heavy. When I looked, I saw nothing at first, just the corridor, washed in that buzzing yellow light. But then, slowly, the shadow emerged again. Whoever it was pressed themselves so tight against the wall that their outline blurred with the plaster, but I could see the faint curve of a shoulder, the glossy reflection of an eye turned toward me. I stumbled back, choking on air. The chain rattled when I checked it, my fingers trembling. That was when I noticed the letterbox twitch. Just a fraction, the metal flap lifting as though someone's breath pressed against it from the other side. "No," I whispered, useless, a child's denial. The flap lifted again, higher this time. I bolted for the bedroom, slammed the door, wedged the chair beneath the handle. For a while, nothing happened. Minutes dragged like hours. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that the locks would hold. But then the scraping returned, louder now, not fingernails but something sharper, dragging along the wood of the front door. And then a sound I'll never forget, the faint metallic tick of the chain sliding. I froze. My chest seized. I had set the chain. I knew I had. But it moved anyway, deliberate, patient, as though someone were lifting it one link at a time. The front door creaked open an inch. I couldn't breathe. From my bedroom I heard the floorboards outside groan under weight, slow steps moving across the flat. I clamped my hand over my mouth to smother the scream building in my throat. The chair shuddered as pressure pressed against the bedroom door. It didn't burst open. That would have been merciful. Instead, the pressure eased, then returned, a steady rhythm, testing. The door frame cracked slightly, the wood splintering near the handle. My whole body shook, sweat pouring down my back, legs cramping where I crouched. Then silence. Worse than the noise. The kind of silence that swallows every breath you take, makes you wonder if you've already died. I strained to hear, ears aching, but there was nothing. No creak, no scrape. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. At some point, my phone slipped from my hand. I don't remember dropping it, only that when I scrambled to find it again, it was gone. Not under me, not beside me, gone. I didn't want to believe what that meant. The handle turned once, firmly, and the chair skidded half an inch across the floor. My lungs convulsed. I pressed harder into the corner, nails biting into my palms. And then, softly, impossibly close, a whisper through the crack of the door. My name. Drawn out, almost tender. The chair toppled then. The door swung inward. I wish I could say I fought, but terror anchored me. A shape filled the doorway, blotting out the light, taller than I expected, the edges of a hood shadowing their face. Only the glint of teeth showed as they smiled down at me. The last thing I remember is the smell, damp fabric, metal, something acrid like burnt wires as they stepped forward. My scream finally tore free, but it was cut short by the weight that fell over me. After that, nothing. No one heard. No one came. And if anyone finds this account, it means I never left this flat alive. Story 3, The Flicker in the Pines. I booked the cabin on a whim. That's the truth of it. It had been a training month at work, and when my manager suggested I recharge somewhere quiet, I decided to take her advice literally. An email from a short-term rental site landed in my inbox at the right moment. Secluded woodland retreat perfect for writers, artists, and those seeking solitude. The photos sold me. Dark timber walls, a stone fireplace, a generous porch overlooking tall pines. It wasn't fancy, but it radiated calm. The nearest town was 40 minutes away, and the listing proudly declared, no Wi-Fi, no TV, no distractions. At the time, that sounded like exactly what I needed. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the sun was still high and warm. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel drive, hemmed in by dense trees. The gravel crackled beneath my tires, a strangely loud sound after the muted hum of motorway travel. I parked in the open space in front of the porch, turned off the engine, and for the first time in months heard nothing but wind and leaves. No traffic, no voices, no phone buzzing. Just silence, heavy and expectant. I stepped out and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of resin and damp soil. I could almost believe I had left a modern world behind. Inside, the cabin was smaller than the pictures suggested, but cozy. A single open room with a kitchenette tucked in one corner, a sofa facing the fireplace, and a small table pushed beneath a window. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was rustic but functional, mismatched crockery, creaking floorboards, thin curtains that swayed when I walked past as though disturbed by my presence. I unpacked quickly. A weekend bag, a bag of groceries, a notebook. That was all I had brought. I told myself I would write, maybe sketch, and most importantly, rest. As daylight softened, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched shadows lengthen through the pines. It was beautiful, if slightly oppressive. The trees crowded close, their trunks dark against the amber sky. I found myself listening to the wind more intently than necessary, convinced it carried faint shapes of sound. A whistle, or perhaps the cry of some unseen bird. I shook it off. Of course the forest was alive. That was the point of coming here. Night fell swiftly. I cooked pasta, read a few chapters of a novel, and turned in early. Without the buzz of electronics, the hours stretched oddly, each one thicker than usual. My phone, set to airplane mode, served only as a clock. At 10 p.m. I slid beneath the covers, listening to the groan of the old building settling into darkness. The first night passed without incident. I woke refreshed, sunlight spearing through thin curtains. I brewed coffee and went for a short walk around the cabin, following a path of flattened pine needles deeper into the trees. A few minutes in, I became aware of how easy it would be to lose direction here. Every tree resembled the last, and the sound of gravel under my shoes diminished quickly. I returned to the cabin sooner than planned, slightly unsettled by the realization that I had no map, no signal, and no real idea of my bearings. The day drifted pleasantly, though. I wrote a little, napped on the porch, sketched the outline of trees. It felt meditative, and I congratulated myself on making such a good decision. That night was different. I went to bed around 11, after sitting up late with a candle and my notebook. Sometime in the night, I would later check and see that it was almost exactly 2 a.m. I woke suddenly, as though nudged by something external. The cabin was pitch dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. My ears strained. At first there was nothing, only the pulse of silence. Then I heard it, voices. They were distant, outside, muted by trees. I couldn't make out words, only tone, a murmur rising and falling, like a conversation conducted just out of range. My chest tightened. There were no other cabins nearby, no neighbors. Who would be walking through the forest at 2 in the morning? I sat up, debating whether I was still half dreaming. The voices faded, then surged again, closer this time. A trick of the wind, I told myself. Sound carried strangely in woods. Perhaps hunters or campers. Rational, ordinary explanations. Then a different sound sliced through, the click of a car door shutting. My stomach lurched. I slipped from bed, padded to the window, and carefully parted the curtain. The driveway lay in shadow, my car parked exactly where I had left it. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then the headlights blazed on, twin beams cutting across the porch. The blood drained from my face. I hadn't touched the keys. They were on the kitchen counter. I froze, one hand on the curtain, unable to breathe. The engine didn't start, just the lights, glowing unwaveringly. After what felt like a full minute, they flicked off again, plunging everything back into darkness. The voices had ceased. Only the hush of wind remained. I forced myself away from the window, pressing my back to the wall, heart hammering. My rational brain scrambled for answers. A faulty electrical system? A neighbor playing a prank? But who knew I was here? The booking had been online, anonymous. I hadn't told anyone the exact location. I stayed awake until dawn, wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, listening intently. No further sounds disturbed me, though each groan of the cabin made me flinch. When morning finally broke, pale and indifferent, I crept outside. The gravel was undisturbed. The car sat innocently, dew glistening on its roof. I tried the doors, locked. The keys were exactly where I had left them. I stood there for a long time, staring at the vehicle, waiting for some sign. But it was just a car. My car. The previous night already felt dreamlike, as though I had exaggerated it in half sleep. Still, unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I told myself I wouldn't stay another night. Yet even as I thought it, I knew I was lying. Something compelled me to remain, curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to be frightened away. But I couldn't ignore the truth. The forest was no longer merely quiet. It was watching. I spent most of the next day in a haze, moving through the cabin as though my body and mind were slightly misaligned. Coffee tasted bitter, my notebook remained blank, and every time I glanced at the car through the window I felt the hairs on my arms prickle. I told myself I should leave. Pack my bag, get in the car, and drive until the forest shrank to a smear in the rearview mirror. But the idea lodged in me like a splinter. If I left, I'd never know what had really happened. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe exhaustion had made me hallucinate. Unless I stayed another night, I'd never know. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened overhead, dimming the forest into an early dusk. I forced myself to do something practical, chop wood stacked beside the cabin. The rhythmic thud of the axe steadied me. Each strike echoed into the trees and came back slightly warped, as if the forest repeated my actions with a delay. By the time my arms ached, I had convinced myself I was foolish. Electrical faults happened. Dreams bled into waking life. Still, when I carried the logs inside, I checked the car again. It sat mute, windows fogged slightly from the temperature drop. A perfectly ordinary machine. Dinner that evening was perfunctory: bread, cheese, a few slices of fruit. I ate while staring out the window at the darkening tree line. At some point I realized I had been holding my breath. By 9 o'clock, rain began to fall. First a scatter, then a steady downpour drumming on the roof. The sound was strangely soothing, muffling the forest into a single texture. I let the fire burn low, pulled a blanket onto the sofa, and tried to read. For a while, I succeeded in convincing myself that the night would pass quietly. The rain built a cocoon around the cabin, washing away stray thoughts. By 11, I was drowsy enough to head for bed. But at 2:06 a.m., I woke again. This time there were no voices. Only silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums. Even the rain had stopped, as if someone had turned off the sky. I rolled over, trying to smother panic before it ignited. My eyes adjusted to the dark, catching the outline of furniture against faint starlight leaking through the curtains. The embers in the hearth had died completely. Then came the sound. Not voices, not a car door. A slow crunch of gravel, measured and deliberate, just outside the cabin. Someone was walking up the drive. I held still, every muscle locked. The crunch came again, closer. I pictured a silhouette passing beneath the porch light, but of course the bulb was dead. I had tried the switch earlier and found it unresponsive. A third crunch. I couldn't stand it. I slipped out of bed and crept toward the living room window. My feet made no sound on the rug, but the old floorboards moaned faintly, betraying me. I reached the curtain, peeled it back by a fraction. Nothing. The gravel drive gleamed faintly with residual rain, empty except for my car. I swallowed, my throat dry. Maybe I had misheard, maybe. The headlights flared on again. Twin beams seared across the trees, so bright I instinctively dropped the curtain. My knees buckled, and I pressed myself flat against the wall, shivering uncontrollably. The engine didn't start. Just the lights. A long, unwavering blaze. And then footsteps on the porch. Not hurried, not cautious. A steady weight crossing the boards. The sound vibrated through the cabin floor. Whoever it was stopped just outside the front door. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from whimpering. The silence that followed was unbearable. Seconds stretched, bloated, until I could hear my heartbeat ricocheting in my chest. I imagined the door handle turning, the hinges creaking. I imagined a face at the window. But nothing happened. The footsteps did not retreat. They simply ended. As though whoever had approached now stood motionless on the other side of the wall, listening. Minutes crawled. Eventually, the headlights flicked off, plunging everything into suffocating dark. I didn't dare move. I crouched by the wall until the first bird calls of dawn cracked the silence. When daylight seeped in, I finally unlatched the door. My hand shook so violently it took 2 tries. The porch was empty. No footprints marked the wet boards, no indentations marred the gravel. The car sat where it always had, innocent as a sleeping pet. I stumbled forward and yanked open the driver's side door. The lock clicked normally, the key turned smoothly in the ignition. The engine purred, no sign of tampering. I checked the headlights, flicked them on and off. Perfectly responsive. I sagged against the steering wheel, bewildered. My rational mind screamed, "Leave, now." But some stubbornness rooted me. Running would mean surrendering to whatever invisible hand toyed with me. Back inside, I made strong coffee and sat at the table, staring at my trembling hands. I tried to reconstruct the night like evidence in a case. First night, voices, lights. Second night, footsteps, lights, silence. It was escalating. The thought chilled me more than anything else. By afternoon, exhaustion pressed me into bed. I drifted into a shallow doze, plagued by uneasy dreams, tall figures between the trees, faces just out of focus, my car idling without me inside. I woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat. Outside, the sky was bruising towards evening again. I felt trapped in a loop, condemned to relive the same hours with subtle variations. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, sweeping the floor, sharpening pencils, boiling water, but the cabin resisted comfort. The air seemed charged, as if holding its breath for the performance of night. I caught myself pacing, muttering, half laughing at my own paranoia. But deep down I knew, I wasn't imagining this. Something was here with me. As the third night loomed, dread thickened, viscous and inescapable. I realized with sick certainty that the pattern would not stop. It would only grow bolder. And for reasons I couldn't name, I knew it wasn't the cabin it wanted. It was me. I didn't even pretend I'd get sleep on the third night. By late afternoon, as dusk bruised the horizon, I had already dragged a chair to the front window and positioned myself with a blanket and a mug of coffee. If it was going to happen again, I wanted to see it coming. The cabin interior felt claustrophobic. Shadows collected in the corners before the sun had fully set, as though darkness had learned to arrive early. I turned on every lamp, lit the fireplace, even left a candle flickering on the table. The combined glow fought against the night pressing at the windows. At 10 o'clock, I checked the locks for the third time. The front door, the bedroom window, even the flimsy bathroom latch. My keys stayed firmly in my pocket. I wanted no uncertainty about where they were. Hours passed. The fire hissed softly. The candle guttered, sending pale wax crawling down its side. At some point, fatigue seeped into me despite my caffeine vigilance. My eyelids drooped. I don't remember closing them, only jerking awake to the sound of gravel crunching. It was 2:04 a.m. The sound was different this time. Heavier. As though more than one person approached, their steps overlapping, a slow procession moving up the drive. I clenched the blanket in my fists. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, I saw nothing at first, just trees swaying faintly in starlight. Then, as my gaze shifted, the headlights ignited again. But not only mine. A second pair flared on, angled from behind, further down the drive. White light collided with white light, washing the forest in blinding brilliance. My breath hitched. There was only one car here, mine. The beam shuddered as though engines vibrated, but I heard no engines. Only footsteps. I pressed my forehead to the wall, torn between bolting for the back door and freezing where I was. The footsteps multiplied, surrounding the cabin. I couldn't tell how many, 3, 5, more. They moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, circling. Then came the voices again. Not murmurs this time, but low chanting, syllables repeated in a cadence too even to be conversational. They overlapped, rising and falling, a tide of sound that pressed through the windows, seeped beneath the floorboards. My rational mind fractured. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at 2 in the morning, chanting in unison? What possible explanation could there be? I crawled away from the window and crouched behind the sofa, heart rattling like a trapped bird. The chanting grew louder, closer, until it vibrated in my teeth. And then silence. Headlights out. Everything gone, as if it had never existed. The abrupt absence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear, to locate even the faintest trace of movement. Nothing. Only the familiar ache of blood rushing in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost sense of time, crouched there, waiting. At last, exhaustion buckled me. I slumped sideways on the rug, too drained to care if dawn ever came. When light finally leaked through the curtains, I staggered outside. The gravel was undisturbed. No tire tracks, no second car. My own stood alone, dew dripping from its hood. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for prints. The earth was soft from rain, yet I found nothing but my own from the previous day. I returned to the porch, shaking. Either I had lost my grip on reality, or something existed here that left no trace. Neither possibility comforted me. Inside, I packed a bag. Enough. Curiosity was no longer worth it. Whatever this was, I wanted no part. But when I slid into the driver's seat, the key refused to turn. The ignition lock jammed solid, immovable. I tried again and again, my hands slick with sweat. Nothing. I stumbled out, cursing aloud, and kicked the tire. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the forest swallowed it. Back inside, panic gnawed at me. No phone service. No neighbors. No way to leave until the car decided otherwise. I spent the day pacing, then slumping in despair, then pacing again. Each time I glanced out the window, the car sat placidly, as though mocking me. By evening, I was almost relieved. At least nightfall meant the waiting would end. Something would happen, and uncertainty was worse than terror. Still, when 2 a.m. came, dread surged like acid in my throat. I sat rigid in the chair, watching the window. The headlights blinked on instantly, without preamble, searing white across the forest. This time, I didn't hide. I stood, pressed my face to the glass, and looked directly into the beams. Shapes moved between the lights. Tall, too tall, their limbs jointed wrong, bending slightly sideways as they glided over the gravel. Their outlines shimmered, as though my eyes resisted focusing. I gasped and stumbled back. The chanting began again, louder, surrounding the cabin in concentric waves. The shapes drew closer, indistinct yet undeniable. One stopped at the porch steps. I heard the wood creak, the same deliberate weight as before. The door handle rattled. I backed into the hallway, shaking so hard I could barely stand. The handle turned once, twice, then stilled. A knock followed. Slow, rhythmic, as though rehearsed. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated through my skull. When it stopped, I lowered my hands and heard whispering directly outside the bedroom window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I lay on the floor, fists jammed against my eyes, whispering nonsense to myself until the chanting faded, the lights died, and silence returned. When dawn came, I peeled myself off the floor, body stiff, mind shredded. I realized then that leaving might no longer be an option. Not because of the car, but because whatever haunted this place knew I was here, and it wasn't finished with me yet. The fourth night arrived like a predator. I didn't sleep during the day, too anxious to close my eyes, too aware that darkness was inevitable. I fortified myself with caffeine and whatever scraps of calm I could muster, pacing the cabin, listening to every creak, every sigh of the old timbers. By 9 p.m., I had barricaded the doors with chairs and stacked firewood against the porch sliding door. It felt absurd, childish even, but I needed something, anything, to give me a sense of control. The flashlight I had tucked in my bag was beside me at all times, its beam slicing through the room like a fragile spear. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no rustling. The air smelled damp but sterile, as though the rain had cleansed everything alive. I kept peeking through the curtains, willing myself to see nothing, to confirm the absence of headlights or figures. Midnight passed. The fire had burned low again, the candle guttering. I sat rigid, listening to my own heartbeat, counting the seconds until 2 a.m. When it came, the headlights ignited instantly, twin beacons carving through the pines. My breath froze. Only this time, they didn't just shine, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, sweeping across the porch before resting back on the car. And then, the engine growled. Low. Rumbling. Not the idle hum of a machine, but the growl of a living thing. I stepped back instinctively, fumbling for the flashlight. The beam trembled in my hands, angled toward the doorway. The door handle rattled immediately. Then the knock. Single. Sharp. Metallic. I froze. Every rational thought fled. I wanted to call it coincidence, a prank, mechanical fault, but there was none. Not this time. Then I heard it, a voice. Clear. My voice. Whispering my name. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the floor, yet I could still hear it, outside, distinct, impossibly close. My own name, drawn out with deliberate malice. I staggered to the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. The headlights cast long shadows across the porch. My car sat there. Perfectly normal, perfectly impossible. And then I saw it, or rather, him. A figure in the driver's seat, hunched, features hidden in shadow. But the silhouette was unmistakable, my own body. My own shape, exactly, sitting behind the wheel as though I had driven here myself. Panic erupted. My hands went to my mouth. My legs trembled uncontrollably. I backed away, pressed against the wall. I wanted to run, to hide, to vanish into the forest, but my mind stalled. The chanting began again, low and deliberate, outside. Multiple voices, yet one distinct rhythm. It surrounded the cabin. Then the figure climbed out. My figure. Not walking normally, it moved jerkily, unnaturally, limbs bending in ways that made the hair on my arms spike. It advanced toward the cabin. I grabbed the chair I had used to barricade the door and swung it in front of me. It stopped at the porch, tilted its head, just slightly, mimicking me, and the headlights flicked. The glow caught the face, and I could see it clearly. Not a mask. Not a trick of light. My own face. Pale, eyes hollow, lips parted as though the mouth were only for show. I screamed. The figure leaned closer to the door. I could hear it breathe, the sound grotesquely slow, a rasping that carried through the wooden boards. I fell backward. My shoulders slammed into the table. The flashlight rolled across the floor. The candle toppled, guttering out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The porch light flicked off. The chanting stopped. The air pressed against my skin, thick and cold, smelling of damp earth and iron. I listened to the silence, counting my breaths, willing myself to be alive. Minutes passed or hours, I couldn't tell. Then, a sound that made me jump so violently I knocked the chair over, the car door opening. Slow. Deliberate. My stomach lurched. My body screamed to bolt, but I didn't move. A hand touched the porch railing. I could feel it through the wall, see it in the shadow of my peripheral vision. The fingers were mine. Then the whisper, "Come outside." It wasn't a suggestion. Not a voice. Not words. An imperative that echoed inside my skull, pressing into my bones. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I thought of rational explanations, mirrors, reflections, dreams, but none fit. Nothing explained this. I heard the steps retreat. The headlights blinked off. The car engine faded to nothing. Silence returned. By the time dawn arrived, I was on the floor, shivering, rocking slightly, staring at the blank wall. I couldn't eat, couldn't drink, could barely stand. My mind raced in loops, trying to reason, to dismiss, to prove to myself that it hadn't happened. And yet, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Because the moment I touched the keys, when I thought of driving away, I knew the figure would be waiting. And somehow, it would follow. All rational thought fled in that moment. Only dread remained. A cold, creeping certainty that my own body had become a weapon aimed at me. I didn't sleep again. I stayed awake until the sun rose fully, bathing the forest in light that felt thin, insufficient, powerless against what lurked outside. I needed a plan. A real plan. Not barricades, not hiding. Something definitive. Something final. I didn't yet know what it was, but I knew I would see it tonight. Night came like a shroud. I had prepared in silence, arranging the cabin as though it were a trap. I blocked the doors with furniture, moved the heaviest objects in the living room in front of the windows, and kept a flashlight and a knife within reach. I had barely eaten, barely moved, only watched the clock tick toward 2 a.m. As the hour approached, the forest pressed in closer, shadows pooling unnaturally near the cabin. I could feel the air vibrating with anticipation, as though the night itself were alive. I crouched behind the sofa, eyes fixed on the window. At exactly 2:01 a.m., headlights flared. Mine, or something wearing my car, blazed across the forest. My stomach twisted violently. I braced myself. The figure stepped out. Not me. Not exactly. Something wrong, something inhuman. Limbs twisted unnaturally, shoulders and elbows bending angles no human body should. Its face reflected my own, yet hollowed, pale as winter moonlight, eyes black, pitiless voids. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Sound would betray me. I backed slowly toward the hallway, knife trembling in my hand. The chanting began low, guttural, surrounding the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small. The figure advanced slowly, deliberate. Every movement echoed, unnatural, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings. Then it stopped at the porch, tilting its head. I felt it watching me, feeling me, understanding my every move. My mind raced, searching for logic, for escape. None came. In desperation, I remembered the fireplace. The fire had almost gone out. If I could ignite it, perhaps the light would drive it back, or maybe only expose it. I crawled to the hearth, shaking violently, and struck a match. Flame caught quickly. Light blossomed, golden and fragile. The figure recoiled slightly. Shadows danced on the walls. It hissed, a sound between a breath and a scream, the air vibrating with it. Then it charged. I ran. Not toward the car, toward the back door. I yanked it open. The forest swallowed me immediately, cold fingers of wind tugging at my hair and clothes. The gravel crunched under my boots as I ran blindly, branches whipping my face. I didn't look back, but I heard it. Footsteps, countless footsteps, matching mine, yet not mine. A chorus of whispers, echoing my name, mocking, demanding. I stumbled, almost fell. Branches tore my jacket. Dirt and needles clung to my skin. Still, I ran, guided only by instinct and the vague memory of the main road. Then I saw it, a light, weak but real, blinking between the trees. A car. Headlights angled toward me. Relief washed over me, but fear remained. Was it mine? Or the thing I had fled? I ran harder. Screamed, maybe. The thing followed, keeping pace. Closer. My breath came in ragged bursts. I reached the car, slammed the door, locked it. The engine turned over immediately. As I floored the accelerator, headlights on the road ahead illuminated the forest, but no figure emerged. The chanting ceased, as though it had never been. My lungs burned. My hands shook on the wheel. I didn't stop until the cabin was a distant shadow behind me, swallowed by the trees. Hours later, I pulled into the nearest gas station, trembling uncontrollably. The attendant looked at me like I was insane. I didn't speak. I didn't explain. I just paid, bought a bottle of water, and drove. Back in town, sunlight finally breaking through clouds, I pulled over, hands on the wheel, shaking. The forest faded behind me, distant, ordinary again. I checked the rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see the headlights flicker behind me. Nothing. I told myself it was over. That I had survived. That whatever had taken the form of me remained in the cabin, trapped by its own rules. Rational thought returned slowly. My keys, my car, the ordinary road beneath my tires, they were real. Weeks later, I sold the cabin rental online without reading the fine print. I avoided the forest entirely. Yet sometimes, in the silence of night, I could swear I hear it, the faint whisper of my own voice calling back, carried by the wind, accompanied by headlights blinking faintly at the edge of perception. But I do not return. I never will. Because I have learned one immutable truth: some places do not want you to leave unaltered. Some things wait in the shadows of familiarity, patient, mimicking, learning. And I cannot, under any circumstances, let it follow me. I survived. The cabin still stands, hidden among pines, waiting for the next visitor to step inside and find a reflection that is not themselves. I will never know exactly what it was. Only that it was mine, and I was almost not mine, and the night can take you whole if you let it. I drove away, and I am here, but I will never forget the sound of gravel beneath countless feet, the cold weight of the headlights, and the hollow echo of my own name. Some horrors are not meant to be understood. They are only to be survived. And survive I did. Story 4: The Visitor at Midnight. Chapter 1. The night shift had always been a quiet, almost hypnotic part of the job. I was used to the dim fluorescent lights buzzing softly above the hallways, the occasional beep of monitors, and the muted footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Nights were slower, predictable, even comforting in their monotony. But that Tuesday night, everything changed. I arrived at the hospital at 7:30 p.m., coffee in one hand, bag slung over my shoulder. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the winter air bit at my skin as I walked toward the revolving doors. Inside, the warmth of the lobby contrasted sharply with the chill outside. I signed in, exchanged greetings with the night clerk, and headed toward the nurse's station in the intensive care wing. The hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic and old linoleum. I liked that smell. It reminded me I was in a place of care, of order, of life maintained by vigilance. I made my rounds quickly, checking charts, updating notes, ensuring that all my patients were stable. By 10 o'clock, the routine had settled around me like a comfortable shroud. I made my way to the break room to pour another cup of coffee, listening to the distant hum of a heart monitor and the occasional squeak of a cart on tile. The hospital felt almost serene, a suspended world where the outside night didn't exist, where nothing unexpected could touch you. I was refilling my cup when the intercom crackled. "Nurse, please respond to the front desk. A visitor is asking for directions." Sighing, I wiped my hands on my scrubs and walked toward the lobby. I wasn't expecting anyone. Visiting hours had ended hours ago, and security was strict about late arrivals. When I stepped into the main lobby, a man stood by the reception desk. He was average height, dark hair combed neatly, wearing a jacket that looked slightly too formal for the season. His posture was rigid, almost tense. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but measured. "I'm looking for a patient." I smiled politely. "Visiting hours are over, sir. Can I ask who you're here to see?" He hesitated, glancing briefly down the hall before meeting my eyes. "The name is Jonathan Archer." I paused. That name didn't register. I opened the visitor log and the patient directory on the computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Nothing came up. No Jonathan Archer in any wing, ICU, or general. "I'm sorry," I said cautiously. "There's no one by that name here." The man's face remained neutral, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that made me uneasy. "I was told he would be here," he said. "Room 214. I frowned. ICU didn't even have a room 214. The general wards only went up to 180. I think there must be a mistake. There's number 214 and no Jonathan Archer in our system. Are you sure that's correct?" He nodded, almost mechanically. "I'm certain. He's expecting me." The hair on the back of my neck prickled. There was something off about the way he spoke, something rehearsed, like a line delivered over and over until it felt right. I motioned for him to sit while I checked with security. He didn't sit. Instead, he shifted slightly from foot to foot, scanning the lobby. The fluorescent lights above flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move along the far wall, but when I turned, it was gone. I returned my attention to him. "Sir, I can call the charge nurse. Maybe she can help you." He shook his head. "No. I'll find him myself." Something in the way he said it made my stomach twist. Normally, visitors were anxious, apologetic, cooperative. This man was calm but insistent, almost patient. Too patient. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop trembling. "Look, I can't let you wander the hospital alone. It's against policy." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then took a step toward the corridor leading to the patient rooms. My instinct screamed, warning me that this was wrong, that this person didn't belong here, yet I found myself unable to look away. I followed, my shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum. The hall was deserted, monitors faintly beeping, the air sterile and humming with fluorescent light. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the end of the corridor, glancing at each closed door as if expecting them to open and reveal something. "Please," I said, trying to assert control. "I need you to stop. This is private. I can't let you." He turned slightly, and for a brief instant, I caught the corner of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was just enough to unsettle me. Not threatening exactly, but wrong. At the end of the hall, he stopped in front of a blank wall. He pressed his hand against it lightly, as if testing for a hidden door, and whispered, almost reverently, he should be here. I swallowed hard. My rational brain was screaming. There's no room here. No patient. No Jonathan Archer. Yet the man's certainty, the way he moved, the hollow weight in his gaze, made me question myself. I heard a faint rustling behind me. I turned. The hall was empty. The monitors were steady. Nothing had changed. When I looked back, the man was closer. Not moving in the ordinary sense, but somehow closer. A subtle shift, a suggestion of presence, pressing into the corner of my mind. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Sir, you need to leave. Now." He nodded again, almost deferentially this time. But his lips didn't move. And in the reflection of the window next to us, I saw the corridor behind him extend impossibly, shadowed, stretching farther than the walls should allow. I blinked, and it snapped back. The hall was normal. Empty. The man smiled fully then, small and cold. I'll find him. Before I could react, he turned and walked toward the next corridor. I followed, heart hammering. The hospital, familiar and ordinary at the start of the night, had become alien, each corner shifting subtly, each shadow whispering possibilities I did not want to consider. By the time I realized that he wasn't supposed to exist at all, it was too late. He had disappeared down a side hall I had never seen, yet somehow knew existed. And I knew, with an icy certainty, that whatever waited for me in that hallway was not a mistake, not a visitor, and certainly not human. I didn't sleep after that encounter. The hospital felt wrong, as if the walls themselves had shifted overnight. Every time I passed a mirror or a window, I half expected to see him again, standing behind me, calm, unhurried, eyes hollow yet fixed with that impossible certainty. By midnight, I had patrolled the halls twice, checking on patients, adjusting monitors, pretending the ordinary routines of care could ground me. But the ordinary no longer existed. Around 1:15 a.m., the intercom crackled. "Nurse, please respond to the front desk. A visitor is asking for directions." My stomach dropped. I froze for a long moment, hand lingering on the phone cord. Could it be him? I hadn't seen anyone else arrive, and the lobby had been empty when I checked less than an hour ago. I made my way cautiously toward the main desk, alert for any movement. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, sending a tremor through my nerves. The smell of antiseptic was sharper than usual, almost acrid, and the hum of the monitors seemed to thrum in time with my heartbeat. The man was there. Of course he was. Standing exactly where he had been earlier, jacket neat, hair combed, eyes still hollow, expression calm. He didn't move as I approached. "Sir," I said cautiously, "you were just here. There's no one named Jonathan Archer in the hospital. You need to leave." He nodded, slow, deliberate. "I know, but he is here. I can feel it." I blinked, trying to force myself to be rational. Perhaps a hallucination? Sleep deprivation can do strange things. Perhaps he wasn't real. Or perhaps, God help me, I had already crossed into something I didn't understand. "I'm calling security," I said, and reached for the phone on the desk. He shook his head. "No. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like the walls." A cold wave ran down my spine. His words made no sense, yet resonated with some deep, instinctual fear. "Who doesn't like the walls?" I asked. My voice sounded small, weak, uncertain even to myself. He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The patient. Jonathan. He doesn't like the walls." The words were normal enough, ordinary even, but the way he said them, slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, made them feel like a curse. My fingers tightened around the phone. Suddenly, movement at the end of the lobby caught my eye. A shadow stretching along the wall, flickering in the light. It wasn't cast by him, or by anything I could see. It was darker, more fluid, and yet unmistakably present. I glanced back at him. He didn't react, didn't move. But somehow, the shadow seemed connected to him, or to something he was guiding. My pulse hammered, nausea rising. "Sir," I said, trying to regain control, "you can't be here. I need you to leave." "I will," he said softly. "But I have to find him first. He's waiting." I backed up instinctively. The lobby stretched before me, the far corridor seemingly longer, darker, unfamiliar. It hadn't looked like that before. I tried to take another step. The lights flickered, throwing strange angles across the floor, and the shadow I had seen moved faster, coiling toward the wall like smoke with intent. I stumbled over my own feet, tripping slightly, and the man, no, the visitor, shifted subtly, tilting his head in a way that made him seem less human. Not monstrous exactly, but wrong. There was something uncanny about his posture, the unnatural stillness beneath his calm. I swallowed hard. I wanted to run. I wanted to call for help. But my voice seemed to vanish, caught in my throat, leaving me alone with him, alone with the shadows, alone with the impossibility of it. And then he began walking. Not toward me, not away, but through the side hallway that led to rooms no one should ever be in. I felt the shift immediately. The air thickened. The fluorescent hum deepened into a low drone, vibrating in my teeth. I wanted to stop him, to intervene, to assert reason. But as I followed, my rational brain screamed that it would be a mistake. He moved differently than a human could, gliding just above the floor, shadows clinging to him, darkening the walls in a way the lights couldn't dispel. Room numbers passed, one after another. Familiar numbers, but somehow wrong. I felt like the hallway itself had grown, elongated, stretching into infinity. I realized then that I had no map, no bearings, no idea how to escape once I entered this impossible corridor. Finally, he stopped at a door that shouldn't exist. Room 214. Pale green walls, peeling paint along the corners. A faint buzzing emanated from within, like a fluorescent light trapped behind glass, yet there was no bulb. The visitor raised his hand, tapping lightly against the door. Whispering followed, soft, nearly inaudible, yet undeniably there. Words I could not understand, rhythms I could not follow. I wanted to flee, yet my body refused. My instincts screamed for me to retreat, but curiosity and terror anchored me in place. He turned to me, eyes hollow, expression patient yet unnerving. He's here. Can you feel it? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. Something in the room called to me, an irresistible pull that made the air taste metallic, thick, like fear had weight. The visitor smiled, just slightly, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. It's yours to see now. I knew then, with an icy certainty, that stepping through the door would change everything. That whatever awaited inside was beyond explanation, beyond understanding. And I had no choice but to move forward. I stood before the door for what felt like hours, though the clock behind me ticked on silently, unhelpful and indifferent. My hands were shaking, slick with sweat, as I pressed my palm against the cold metal handle. The hallway stretched behind me, familiar yet wrong, each shadow twitching at the edge of perception. Do you want me to? The visitor's voice was soft, measured. I cut him off with a shake of my head. I didn't want him guiding me. I didn't want anyone involved. I wanted to make it stop. But I couldn't leave either. The pull from the room was magnetic, insidious. Finally, with a trembling exhale, I turned the handle and pushed. The door creaked, hinges groaning in protest, and a dim light spilled into the hallway. It wasn't fluorescent, it was softer, sickly, almost yellow, tinged with shadow that moved of its own volition. I stepped inside. The room was small, far too small for the corridor that had led me here. A single bed sat in the center, sheets rumpled. The air was thick, the temperature cold yet humid, clinging to my skin like a second layer. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. And there, on the bed, was the patient. Or at least, someone. Jonathan Archer, or what should have been him, lay perfectly still. Features familiar from some memory I could not place, but wrong. The eyes were open, too large, too black. The skin pallid and waxy, almost reflective under the sickly light. My stomach twisted violently. I took a step closer. The visitor followed silently, just behind me, calm, patient. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand explanation. But the words stuck in my throat. The air itself seemed to resist sound. The patient's head turned slowly, impossibly. Not a twitch, not a shiver, but a deliberate movement that aligned perfectly with my gaze. I wanted to retreat, yet my legs refused. The room's gravity seemed to anchor me, to ensure I could not leave without understanding. "Do you see him?" the visitor asked, voice quiet. Not a question, but a test. "Yes," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign in the room. Weak. Hollow. "Good," he said. "He's been waiting." I stepped closer to the bed. The closer I got, the more impossible details revealed themselves. The fingers were too long, the hands too smooth, the veins raised unnaturally against pale skin. Even the rhythm of breathing too slow, too even, almost mechanical. I recoiled instinctively. My rational brain screamed, "This is impossible. This is a hallucination. I am exhausted." But a deeper, colder voice whispered, "No. This is real." The visitor knelt beside the bed, hand hovering above the patient's chest. Not touching, just suspended. His gaze was locked on the form, reverent, precise. "You feel it too," he murmured. "The waiting. The stillness. The hunger." I didn't understand. Hunger? The patient didn't move. Didn't speak. Just lay there, inert, eyes staring through the ceiling. I felt a wave of nausea, my knees weakening. Suddenly, the door slammed behind me. I spun around, flashlight bouncing across walls that seemed to warp and twist, the corridor outside gone. Only the room remained. My own shadow stretched unnaturally across the floor, fragmented, as if multiple versions of me were crouched in the corners. The visitor turned his hollow gaze toward me. "He has been patient," he said. "And now, he chooses." Before I could react, the patient's body shifted, rising from the bed without bending knees, without movement that any human frame could accomplish. A silhouette of my own shape stepped forward, the black eyes fixing on me. I stumbled back, nearly falling over the bed. The air felt dense, almost viscous, clinging to my skin, pressing against my lungs. The shadowy version of Jonathan Archer, or whatever he was, extended a hand, long, pale, impossibly thin, and I recognized it instantly. My own hand. Panic erupted. My rational mind fractured entirely. This can't be happening. This can't be real. But the figure advanced, fluid, unstoppable, silent except for the low hum that now seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I bolted for the door. It slammed in my face. Not stuck, not jammed, simply gone. The hallway had vanished. I was trapped inside the room, the door replaced by a blank wall pulsing faintly with shadow. The visitor watched from the bed, kneeling calmly as if witnessing a test. "He chooses," he repeated, and gestured toward the figure advancing on me. I backed into the corner, breathing hard, body trembling uncontrollably. My mind raced for escape, for explanation, for anything. The only thing that came was the undeniable truth. I was not dealing with a human anymore. Not fully. Something had invaded, something patient, something that could mimic life perfectly, and now it had chosen me. The figure stopped a few feet from me. Its face was mine. Every line, every detail. But the eyes, black voids, stared through me, into me. I felt exposed, violated, understood in ways I did not want to be understood. I knew then what the visitor had been waiting for, what he had been guiding me toward. And my body screamed in protest, but my mind had already accepted it. There was no rational explanation, no medical procedure, no patient record that could contain this. Only fear, only certainty, only the sense that something had been orchestrated for weeks, months, maybe years. And I had stepped right into it. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to push past the shadow, to escape into the hallways that no longer existed. But the air was thick, heavy, pressing against my lungs, as if the room itself had grown teeth and was biting at my ribs. I pressed myself against the corner, trying to shrink, trying to vanish, but the thing moved toward me with a calm inevitability that made my stomach twist violently. The visitor remained kneeling, serene, watching silently as if overseeing a lesson I wasn't supposed to understand. His hollow eyes held a patience that was maddening, and a human calm that made my panic feel almost absurd. My heart raced uncontrollably. Each beat sounded like a drum in a cathedral of shadows. The figure stopped only a foot from me. Its black eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of 1,000 silent accusations pressing down. I wanted to scream, but my mouth would not cooperate. Words stuck, swallowed by the dense, viscous air. Then it spoke. Not a voice I recognized, though the shape of its lips mimicked mine perfectly. It didn't say words, rather, it conveyed meaning, ideas pressed directly into my mind with a cold, surgical precision. I understood everything without hearing a sound. You do not belong here. You have trespassed. You are now mine. I stumbled backward, banging into the bed. The figure followed fluidly, impossibly, as if gravity itself bent to its will. Its hand extended, and when it touched my shoulder, the cold radiated through my bones, turning my marrow to ice. The visitor finally spoke, breaking the silence. It has chosen the vessel. Do not resist. Do not fight. Resistance is unpleasant. I didn't understand. Vessel? Chosen? I struggled for comprehension, for rational thought, but none came. Only fear, sharp and piercing, stabbing at the edges of my mind. The figure's lips moved again, silently, but the meaning seeped into me. You are no longer alone in your skin. You are shared. A wave of nausea hit. My vision blurred. The corners of the room darkened further, shadows spilling from walls and floor like ink in water. Shapes formed in the darkness, indistinct, grotesque, stretching toward me with intent. Faces, some familiar, others distorted beyond recognition, pressed at the edges of perception. My own face appeared in some, twisted and mocking. I fell to my knees, shaking violently, trying to press myself against the far wall. My hands clawed at the peeling paint, at the floor, at anything to hold myself in reality. My ears rang with a low, pulsing hum, resonating in rhythm with the shadowed figure, in rhythm with the beating of my own panicked heart. The visitor leaned closer, voice calm, almost soothing. The choice has been made. Acceptance is necessary. Necessary? I croaked. My voice cracked under the weight of terror. What? What do you mean? The visitor's smile widened slightly. He takes what he requires. Only the living can feed it. Only the unwilling are useful. I realized then I was not facing death in the conventional sense. I would not die and leave my body behind. No, I would remain trapped, subsumed, my consciousness invaded by a presence that was patient, deliberate, eternal. The figure raised its hand again, touching my forehead lightly. I screamed inwardly as a cold invasion swept into my mind, filling every corner, every memory, every thought. The room itself seemed to pulse with its presence. Shadows swirled, walls breathing, light flickering, and I felt my identity stretch, bend, and fray at the edges. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into eternities. I could feel the visitor watching, the shadows gathering, the thing within me learning, probing, folding itself into my very being. Resistance was futile. Understanding was irrelevant. Only the slow, inexorable feeling of being consumed remained. And then, the whisper, my own voice. But not my voice. Dark, hollow, patient. Repeating words I hadn't spoken, yet had always known. You belong here. You are chosen. I staggered back, desperate to break free, but my body no longer obeyed. The room's light dimmed entirely, leaving only the figure and the visitor bathed in the unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Shadows pressed closer. I could feel them crawling up my legs, my arms, into my chest. Finally, the visitor rose, standing between me and the figure. His presence was a shield, calm and composed, yet I could sense that even he could not control what had been set in motion. "It is complete," he said softly. "There is no turning back. Only survival, if survival is permitted." The figure advanced one last step, merging partially with me, a cold, suffocating embrace that made my bones ache. Pain and fear coalesced. My mind screamed, yet the voice, the hollow voice, laughed softly inside me, mocking, triumphant. And then, silence. The room snapped back into normality, or what passed for normal. Fluorescent light hummed overhead. My knees were on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The shadows had receded. The visitor was gone. The figure had vanished. Room 214 no longer existed, replaced by a blank wall, peeling paint in dim corners exactly as the corridor should have been. I could move again. I could breathe. But the cold lingered in my bones, the echo of that voice inside me, reminding me that the invasion was not over. Some part of me belonged to that thing now, patient, waiting, hungry. I staggered through the hospital halls, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a sleep-deprived nightmare. Yet every reflection, every shadow, every whisper of movement in the corner of my eye reminded me otherwise. By the time morning arrived, I was hollowed, exhausted, trembling. Rational thought returned slowly, painfully. I knew the hospital was normal again, the patients alive, the corridors orderly, but I also knew that normality was fragile. And I knew, with certainty, that I had survived the night. But only barely. I spent the remainder of the night wandering the hospital halls, trying to ground myself in the ordinary, the beeping of monitors, the squeak of a cart, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. But the ordinary had been fractured, and I could feel the fracture lingering inside me. Every corner I turned, every mirror I passed, seemed to hint that something had followed me, something patient, something aware. By sunrise, I managed to reach the nurse's lounge. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hands shaking violently. I stared into the dark liquid as if it could answer the questions I could not voice. What had I seen? What had I felt? And most importantly, what had attached itself to me? The visitor's words echoed, "He takes what he requires." Only the living can feed it. Only the unwilling are useful. I replayed the night endlessly, each memory more vivid, more horrifying. The hallway that shouldn't exist. Room 214. The shadowed figure with my own face, black voids for eyes, fingers impossibly long. And the whispering voice inside me, the thing that had claimed a part of my consciousness, patient, persistent, and unrelenting. I tried to call someone, security, a colleague, anyone, but my hands trembled so badly I couldn't hold the phone. My voice sounded alien even when I finally managed to croak out words. I knew that explaining what had happened would be futile. No one could comprehend what I had endured. By the time the day's shift arrived, I had made a decision. I would not leave. Not yet. Not while that thing existed inside me. I had to understand it, or at least survive it. I returned to the ICU wing, moving slowly, carefully, watching the empty rooms, monitoring the shadows. Everything appeared normal. Monitors beeped steadily. Patients slept, oblivious. The hospital hummed with mundane life, indifferent to my terror. I checked the visitor log from the night before. No entries. No record of a man named Jonathan Archer. Nothing unusual at all, except my own shattered sense of reality. Hours passed. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that the event was over. But the voice inside me persisted, soft, patient, persuasive. It did not speak with words but with ideas, pressing suggestions into my thoughts, reshaping perceptions. You are not alone. You belong. It waits. It hungers. I fled to the supply room and locked the door, crouching in the corner. I forced myself to breathe, to count, to cling to the rational. Rationality was my only defense, my only tether to sanity. But the room felt smaller, walls pressing inward, shadows curling like smoke at the edges of vision. And then the intercom crackled. A distorted voice, layered, not fully human, spoke my name. It wasn't loud, yet it penetrated every corner of my mind. My body shook violently. I knew that it was testing me, probing, asserting dominance. I realized something horrifying. I could never leave the hospital entirely. Not truly. Not while the thing that had entered me lingered. It could not exist fully in the outside world. It needed the confinement, the always, the patience, the hospital. And it had chosen me as its anchor. I spent the day preparing. Checking doors, making sure nothing could enter my small, temporary refuge in the supply closet. I armed myself with whatever I could find, scissors, syringes, a heavy flashlight. Not to fight, not to resist fully, but to maintain a semblance of control over the fragment of myself that remained my own. By the time night fell again, the hospital was emptying. Visitors gone. Staff reduced to skeleton crews. The lights flickered, a familiar prelude to terror. I knew he, or it, would come tonight. The visitor, the shadow, the patient. They were patient. They waited. And I had no choice but to confront what had claimed a part of me. At 2 a.m., the hallway shimmered. Room numbers warped. Shadows extended unnaturally. And then, there it was, the figure. My own shape, black voids where I should be, moving with the same impossible grace as before. The voice inside me whispered, "You belong. You cannot resist." I gripped the flashlight and stepped forward. Fear coursed through every nerve, but I forced myself to breathe, to move deliberately. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I faced it. The visitor appeared silently beside the figure, kneeling, serene. "It is complete," he said softly. "But survival is possible. Only if you accept the reality and act decisively." I understood then. I could not destroy it. I could not banish it. But I could control its influence, contain it, keep it tethered. I had to, for my own survival. I would live. Not fully free, not fully myself, but alive. The figure stepped back, and the hallway returned to its familiar proportions. Room 214 vanished. Shadows receded. Silence returned. My body shook uncontrollably, but I was intact. I left the hospital at dawn. The city streets were mundane, normal, full of life. No shadows followed me, no whispers lingered in the air. But the voice remained patient, quiet, a constant companion just beneath awareness. I have returned to work. The hospital functions as usual, oblivious to the things lurking in its hidden corridors. But I am changed. I am vigilant. I am cautious. And I am never, ever alone. I survived. Not entirely. Not unscathed. But I survived. And I know, deep in the marrow of my bones, that some part of me will always belong to the visitor, to the patient, to the shadow that waits patiently in the darkness of the hospital. Story 5. The Stranger on the Corner. I first noticed him on a Tuesday, though it took me days to realize he wasn't just another face in the city crowd. I was walking to campus, coffee in hand, early morning chill biting through my jacket, and there he was, leaning against the corner of a brick building, hands stuffed in his pockets, hood pulled low over his face. Something about the way he watched people pass struck me, though at the time I didn't think much of it. The lecture hall that morning was warm and stuffy, the sunlight slanting through tall windows and reflecting off the worn linoleum floors. I sat near the back, headphones in, half listening to my professor drone on about economic theory while my mind wandered. By the time I left, the streets had filled with students, bicycles, and the occasional early delivery truck. I noticed him again, crossing the street in the same slow, deliberate way, just far enough behind me that I couldn't be sure he was looking at me, but close enough to feel a prickling at the back of my neck. At first, I shrugged it off as coincidence. The city was dense. I saw hundreds of people every day. But over the next week, he appeared again, on the platform of the subway, reading the schedule as I waited for my train, outside the small convenience store where I bought lunch, standing on the corner near the library when I left to grab a cab. Each time, the same posture, the same slow, methodical movements, the same hooded gaze. I started to notice other details, the way his shadow seemed to linger longer than natural, stretching across the pavement in angles that didn't quite make sense. The faint click of his shoes on concrete seemed in rhythm with my own heartbeat when I caught a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye. It was subtle, but unsettling. By the end of the second week, my friends noticed my distraction. "You're paranoid," Mark said over coffee in the campus cafe, stirring sugar into his cup. "Maybe you just like seeing patterns where none exist." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to agree. And yet, even as I sipped my latte, my gaze drifted unconsciously to the street outside. There, on the sidewalk, at a distance that should have been meaningless, he stood again, hood drawn, hands in his pockets. I choked on my coffee, nearly spilling it. I tried to convince myself it was random, that it was my imagination. Cities have repetition. People follow similar routes, take similar streets. But every encounter added weight, a slow, inexorable pressure pressing against the edges of my reason. I started adjusting my routes. I would leave class early, take side streets, pause in cafes, linger in bookstores. Every variation, every attempt to evade him, ended the same way. There he was, corners ahead or behind, waiting, patient, like a figure in a recurring dream I couldn't wake from. I told myself to rationalize it. Maybe he was a student, like me, with his own pattern. Maybe he worked nearby, had errands that coincidentally crossed mine. But each time I tried to reason, the feeling grew. He was observing me deliberately. I could feel it in my bones, in the prickling hairs along my arms, in the strange twist of dread tightening around my chest. One evening, I stayed late in the library, hoping to avoid him entirely. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the hum of the air conditioning was steady, hypnotic. I tucked my books under my arm, adjusted my backpack, and stepped into the empty courtyard, the cold concrete pressing against my sneakers. And there he was again, standing beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, just past the fountain. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My rational mind sputtered for explanations, for excuses. Perhaps he was waiting for someone else, or perhaps it was coincidence. But my stomach sank. I had never felt a presence like this, so quietly deliberate, so impossibly still. I crossed the courtyard briskly, heart hammering, hoping that by the time I reached the street corner, he would be gone. But he wasn't. He moved with the same slow rhythm, maintaining a distance, yet always aligning with my path. For the first time, I began imagining what it would mean if he were following me. The thought made my skin crawl. The city's noise, the streetlights, the distant rumble of traffic, all of it seemed muted, irrelevant. My mind narrowed to one certainty. I was aware of him, and he was aware of me. I hurried home, fumbling with my keys at the apartment door, chest heaving. I couldn't shake the sensation, even inside the safety of my small, cluttered apartment. Every shadow cast by the streetlight through the blinds seemed exaggerated. Every creak in the building sounded deliberate, calculated. And as I lay on my bed that night, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it, that tomorrow would be normal again, I couldn't stop thinking about the next encounter. Where would he appear next? And why did it feel as if he had already decided to wait for me there? I didn't sleep well. Every passing siren, every distant footstep, made me tense. Every shadow in my peripheral vision made my pulse spike. And somewhere deep in my chest, I knew that this was no longer coincidence. By the time the first rays of morning crept through the blinds, I was exhausted, anxious, and convinced of one undeniable truth: he was not leaving. And sooner or later, he would find me, wherever I was. The days that followed were unbearable. Every commute, every walk to class, every errand in the city felt like navigating a gauntlet. I became hyper-aware of every passerby, every shadow, every reflection. And always, he was there. Sometimes across the street, sometimes half hidden in a doorway, sometimes just standing at the edge of my vision, hood drawn low, hands buried in his pockets. I began changing my routines obsessively. I left earlier, later, avoided streets I had used for years, took convoluted routes to grocery stores and cafes. Nothing worked. No matter how circuitous my path, no matter how carefully I timed my movements, he appeared. Always the same. Always patient. Always waiting. My friends noticed the changes. "You're obsessing," Rachel said, tapping her fingers nervously on the table at the library cafe. "You can't keep watching the city like a hawk. It's unhealthy." I wanted to tell her, to explain, but even saying it aloud made me doubt myself. What would she think? That I was paranoid? That I was imagining patterns where none existed? But the truth was undeniable. I felt him before I saw him, a weight on the air, a subtle tension that tightened my chest. And every time I looked up, there he was. One evening, I ducked into a small bookstore, hoping to lose him among the aisles of dusty paperbacks. I wandered slowly, trying to appear casual, pretending to browse. But when I glanced up, there he was at the far end, just beyond the last row, leaning against the wall, expression unreadable. My pulse shot through the roof. I left quickly, pretending nothing had happened, heart hammering against my ribs. On the street outside, I slowed, attempting to convince myself that he had gone. But as I rounded the corner toward my apartment, I saw him again. Standing on the opposite side of the street, his gaze fixed on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the window that looked out onto the quiet, lamplit street. Every rustle in the wind, every distant car engine, made me flinch. My thoughts raced endlessly. Who was he? Why me? Was it obsession, coincidence, or something darker? A week later, it escalated. I was leaving the library after midnight, carrying a backpack heavy with textbooks, when I saw him again. This time, he didn't move, didn't wait across the street or linger in a shadowed doorway. He simply stood directly in front of me, blocking my path. I froze, adrenaline surging. "Excuse me," I said cautiously, trying to sidestep him. He didn't budge. The hood covered most of his face, but the faint curve of a mouth was visible. No expression, no smile, just presence. It was suffocating. "I think you're following me," I said, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words, then slowly, deliberately, reached into his pocket. My stomach dropped. A flicker of movement, like the slow draw of something metallic, sent shivers down my spine. My rational brain scrambled for explanations. Keys? A phone? Something harmless? But I couldn't shake the instinctive dread building in my chest. Before I could react, he stepped aside. "I wasn't following," he said quietly, voice calm and even. "I just noticed you." I didn't believe him. Every encounter, every chance meeting, the lingering shadows and impossible patience, there was no way this was coincidence. I nodded stiffly and hurried past, eyes darting around, heart hammering. That night, I barricaded my apartment door with a chair, checking locks 3 times. Every sound in the hallway, footsteps, the thrum of plumbing, distant voices, made me flinch. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if he had truly followed me home. Sleep came in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of him leaning in corners, shadows stretching toward me. The next morning, I resolved to confront the idea that this couldn't continue. I had to regain control. I started carrying pepper spray, changing routines more aggressively, even considering reporting him to campus security. Rational thought struggled against the weight of fear. Maybe it's just obsession on my part. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But that night, I walked back from the grocery store, and as I approached the last block before my apartment, I saw him waiting. Not across the street, not half-hidden, waiting, motionless, under the lamplight directly in front of my building. The same hood, the same posture, the same unyielding patience. I stopped, frozen, and he lifted his head slightly, as if acknowledging me for the first time. My pulse raced uncontrollably. My rational mind screamed at me to ignore him, to turn and run, to call the police, but my legs refused to move. Something primal, older than reason, rooted me to the spot. I realized, with a shiver crawling down my spine, that this was no longer about coincidence. This was deliberate. And that realization was more terrifying than anything I had yet experienced. He had found me. And for the first time, I knew, whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop at chance meetings. The days after that encounter became unbearable. I could no longer convince myself that these were coincidences or chance meetings. Every street I turned down, every corner I avoided, every shortcut I took somehow ended the same way, him, waiting, patient, observing. His presence had settled into my life like a second shadow, quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore. I began documenting every encounter, trying to establish a pattern. I kept a notebook in my backpack, noting times, locations, distances, and any irregularities, how long he lingered, how his gaze tracked me, subtle changes in posture. Rational thought was my only lifeline. If I could find a pattern, I might predict him, avoid him. But the notes themselves became a source of dread. They made the presence tangible, undeniable. One afternoon, I stayed late in the library, hoping to lose him entirely. I wandered among the stacks, pretending to examine books, but my ears were attuned to the faintest sounds, footsteps echoing in the distant halls, the whisper of pages turning, the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then I felt it, his gaze, like a cold finger tracing my spine. I turned sharply, scanning the aisles, and saw him standing in the doorway at the far end of the hall. I froze. My mind raced for explanations. Perhaps he worked here, or maybe it was coincidence. But his stillness, the deliberate calm, the way he seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, made rational explanations dissolve. I ducked behind a shelf, heart hammering, and when I peeked again, he was gone. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I started leaving class early, taking longer, winding routes home. I even considered skipping campus entirely, staying in my apartment, but that only intensified the feeling of being watched. I could feel his presence everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the sudden silence of an empty street. The city itself seemed to conspire, every lamppost, every alleyway, every distant figure contributing to the growing tension. One night, desperate for a semblance of normalcy, I went to the corner cafe. It was quiet, a single row of patrons reading or typing away on laptops. I tried to ignore the back of my mind, the part that insisted on scanning every doorway and window. And there he was, seated at a table in the far corner, but still drawn, hands clasped under the table. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, and yet his presence pressed down, suffocating, like gravity intensified. I forced myself to stay, sipping coffee I barely tasted, heart pounding, every muscle tense. I watched him. He watched nothing in particular, yet I felt certain I was the focus. And then he moved slightly, just a tilt of his head, and my stomach dropped. That single motion carried intention. He knew I was aware. And he didn't mind. I left quickly, stepping into the night air, cold and damp. My breath fogged in front of me, and every sound, the scrape of a trash can lid, the distant rumble of traffic, the faint flutter of wings, made me jump. I felt the street stretch unnaturally as I walked, each step echoing louder than it should. And when I finally reached my apartment building, my key trembling in my hand, he was waiting. Not across the street, not in the shadows, he stood under the lamppost closest to my door, motionless, hooded, patient. My pulse hit a frantic tempo. Rational thought faltered. I fumbled with the lock, hoping to slip inside without being noticed, but the building was silent, too quiet. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. Yet I felt the pull, the undeniable draw of his presence. Inside, I bolted the door, checked it twice, and leaned against it, trembling uncontrollably. My apartment had become a fragile sanctuary, yet I knew instinctively it wasn't enough. He could wait outside indefinitely. The thought gnawed at me, cold and unrelenting. How long before he decided to step inside? How long before he forced this game into the place I called home? Sleep came fitfully, haunted by shadows that moved just beyond the corner of my vision, by footsteps echoing down silent hallways, by the image of his hooded figure standing under the street lamp, still, patient, unblinking. I began waking in the night, heart racing, convinced I heard the click of shoes on concrete, or the faint scrape of a coat brushing against the wall. Each time, I convinced myself it was imagination. But the fear persisted, a tangible presence that lingered even in daylight. By the following week, I realized the inevitable. He had chosen me. It was no longer coincidence. Every pattern, every encounter, every impossible timing confirmed it. And I began to understand, with a sinking, unbearable certainty, that this was no longer just a man in a hood. He was something deliberate, something patient, something willing to wait indefinitely. And I knew, as I peered out the blinds at the quiet city street, that sooner or later, he would no longer wait in shadows. He would be at my door. The dread didn't ease in the days that followed. It thickened, curling around my chest, pressing against my lungs with every step outside my apartment. I tried to convince myself I could avoid him, that altering routines, taking back streets, and leaving at odd hours would work. It didn't. Every route, every plan, every precaution collapsed under the same inevitability. He was there. I saw him most mornings outside the cafe across from campus, hood drawn low, hands in pockets. Some days, He appeared at random corners, at bus stops, on subway platforms, so subtle that I could almost rationalize him as another commuter. But the closer I looked, the more deliberate it became. He mirrored my movements, adjusted his pace to match mine, always keeping a distance that was unnervingly precise. I stopped telling friends. They thought I was exaggerating, imagining patterns. And perhaps I was, but I couldn't ignore the internal compass that screamed he wasn't coincidental. My anxiety bled into everything. My apartment felt less safe. I began double-checking locks, drawing blinds, sitting in the dark for hours, listening. Every wind gust, every distant footstep made me flinch. Every shadow could be him. One night, I attempted to confront the fear directly. I waited outside my building, watching the street lamps flicker, hoping to catch him in the act. The chill gnawed through my jacket, and my hand shook from a combination of cold and adrenaline. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I convinced myself it was a small victory. Rationality whispered that perhaps I had overreacted, that my paranoia was gaining control. And then, without sound, a figure appeared under the far lamppost. Motionless. Calm. Hooded. My blood ran cold. The realization that I hadn't been imagining it hit fully. He had followed me home. He had waited. And he wasn't going away. I backed away slowly, eyes locked on him. The street was quiet, the city was distant, uncaring. My instinct screamed to run, but my body betrayed me with frozen limbs. He didn't move, didn't signal, didn't approach. Yet the air itself seemed to shift, the night pressing down like water around me. I fled indoors, locking the door behind me, sliding to the floor in a trembling heap. But safety was a fragile illusion. I knew he could wait there, silently, just beyond the walls, counting, patient. I began imagining what it would mean if he knew my routines, my apartment layout, my habits, if he had already memorized every detail of my life. The following nights became worse. I avoided leaving home entirely after dark. I learned the exact cadence of my building's creaks, the faint hum of the heater, the occasional scrape of a neighbor's shoes. Every sound that didn't belong to me made me flinch. Shadows moved where there should be none. Reflections in windows, mirrors, and polished surfaces seemed distorted, hinting at a figure just behind me. Always behind me. And then came the night I saw him outside my apartment window. Not a fleeting shadow, not across the street, but directly below the sill, hooded, still, waiting. I froze, heart hammering so violently it hurt. My rational mind screamed, "Call the police. He's trespassing. Get out." But I didn't. Part of me felt paralyzed by the patient inevitability of him standing there. He was not acting randomly. He had decided. And now he was waiting. Sleep eluded me entirely that night. I paced, checked locks, peered through blinds, convinced he might vanish at any second, yet terrified to look too long. Every slight movement in the street, every flicker of the lamplight, every distant sound of tires or footsteps made me flinch. By 3 a.m., I realized the terrifying truth: he wouldn't leave. He had escalated from coincidence to deliberate pursuit. I knew then that I had to act, or at least prepare. I started carrying a knife and a small flashlight whenever I ventured out, though my steps were slow and careful, each one measured. I began examining the entrances and exits to my building, planning potential escape routes. The paranoia became strategy, fear a tool. But the dread was ever present, waiting, patient, as if anticipating my next move. And I knew, beyond doubt, that it wasn't just about being observed anymore. This was about him waiting for the right moment. That patient stillness I had seen in him over and over wasn't idle. It was deliberate, intentional. He had chosen me, and he would continue to wait until he could force a confrontation. By the end of that week, the fear had hardened into certainty. I could no longer leave home after dark. The streets themselves seemed hostile, the city complicit. And I understood, deep in my gut, that this was a game I had already lost. I was no longer merely being watched. I was being hunted. And the night he would choose to step beyond patience, to approach my door, was coming. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound, every flicker of light, every distant footstep made me tense. I had barricaded my apartment door with a chair, triple-checked the locks, and left the blinds closed tight. My phone rested on the table, fully charged, though I was too terrified to call anyone. I was alone, and I knew he was out there. Hours passed, the city quiet, unnaturally quiet. I moved from room to room, listening, trying to convince myself he wasn't there. But instinct told me otherwise. The air seemed heavier, oppressive, as if it had thickened with anticipation. My pulse pounded in my ears. I felt his gaze, invisible yet undeniable, pressing against the thin walls of my apartment. I thought of leaving, running into the night, calling the police, seeking help, but a deeper, unreasoning fear rooted me. I realized he had spent weeks, months, perhaps, learning the rhythm of my life. He knew where I would go, why I would leave, why I would return. Any attempt to flee blindly could play directly into his plan. At 2 a.m., the unmistakable sound came, the faint scraping of shoes against concrete, deliberate, measured. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound grew closer. My heart raced, my body a mixture of adrenaline and paralysis. He was standing outside my door. I could hear him, faintly, as though the vibrations of his presence traveled through the walls. No knocks, no voice, just waiting. Patient. Implacable. I pressed myself against the far wall, listening, willing him to leave, praying that I had imagined it. But I hadn't. Then came the soft, almost imperceptible scraping at the lock. My rational mind screamed, call for help. Do something. But my hands shook violently. I realized in that instant that running was futile. He had learned everything. He had been watching, waiting. And now, the patient stillness I had observed so many times had reached its inevitable conclusion. The door handle moved slightly under the weight of his touch. My pulse thundered. I gripped the knife in my hand, yet I felt powerless, the blade suddenly absurd against whatever force this was. Every shadow in the apartment stretched unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were bending toward him, bending toward me. I whispered his name, almost desperately. Who are you? What do you want? No answer. Just silence. And then, the scraping again, slower now, deliberate. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that he didn't need to enter. The presence itself was enough. The patient, methodical, observant force that had tracked me for weeks now pressed against my mind, bending it, fraying it, asserting dominance. Fear became an organism, tangible, alive, filling every corner of the apartment. I tried to run, tried to flee, but my body didn't respond properly. My limbs felt heavy, disconnected. Every instinct, every strategy, every plan I had made over the past weeks was irrelevant. I was caught in a trap whose walls were my own mind, whose bars were anticipation and dread. Hours passed, or minutes, I couldn't tell. Time itself felt distorted. And then, finally, a subtle shift. The scraping stopped. The oppressive weight remained, but something had changed. I listened, straining for any movement, any sound. Nothing. Morning came. Weak sunlight filtered through the blinds. I stepped cautiously to the window. The street below was empty. No sign of him. No trace. I realized, trembling, that he hadn't left, but he wasn't gone either. He was still there, patient, waiting for another night, another opportunity. I had survived. Barely. Alive, but changed. Shadows haunted my apartment, reflections seemed sharper, darker. I no longer walked with my head held high. I no longer assumed safety. Every step outside, every glance at a figure across the street, reminded me that the city had not released me, that he had not released me. And I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the game was not over. He had chosen me. He would continue to choose me. And though I remained alive, I would never be free. The patient, deliberate force that had pursued me through the city streets had succeeded in one way. I would forever be aware, forever vigilant, forever waiting for the next encounter. I survived. I escaped the immediate danger. But the terror, the knowledge that someone, something, had studied me, tracked me, and could wait endlessly outside my door would remain with me for the rest of my life. And that knowledge, more than any physical threat, was the true horror. I shut the blinds. I locked the door. I sat in the dark, listening, knowing that tonight, as every night, he might return. And I would be ready, or as ready as I could ever be. Story 6, The Van at Dusk. It was an unusually warm evening for early October, the kind of air that made your skin tingle with a mixture of sweat and chill. I had decided to go for a jog along the Riverside Trail, the same route I'd taken countless times over the past year. The path was mostly deserted, a thin scattering of fellow runners and dog walkers lingering under the fading sunlight, shadows stretching unnaturally across the asphalt. I liked the solitude. It made the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the pavement feel meditative, almost cleansing. The river glinted dimly, reflecting the dull orange of the street lamps that would soon flicker on. I kept a steady pace, my breath measured, headphones playing soft, instrumental music to keep me focused. For the first few kilometers, nothing felt out of the ordinary. The breeze carried faint sounds of distant traffic, the occasional bird, and the low hum of city life that never really stopped. Then I noticed the van. It was white, unmarked, nondescript except for the fact that it was moving unusually slowly, a deliberate pace parallel to the path I was running. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting it to merge into the street traffic and disappear. But it stayed with me. A casual observer might not have noticed anything wrong, but instinct flared in my chest, a sudden, sharp awareness that made my hair prickle along my neck. I quickened my pace slightly, rationalizing that perhaps it was a delivery van, someone making a local drop, nothing personal. But then the driver slowed further, sliding the vehicle closer to the curb, matching my steps with almost mechanical precision. I turned, just briefly, enough to catch the two men in the front seats. Neither waved, neither smiled. Their eyes were fixed on me in a way that felt intrusive, deliberate, predatory. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I told myself to relax, that the city was full of people commuting, returning home, just going about their business. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps I was imagining a pattern where none existed. Rational thought tried to assert control, to steady the sudden spike of fear, but my instinct screamed otherwise. A few blocks further, the van slowed even more. I could hear the soft slide of the side door opening, just a whisper against the fading hum of the street. My breath hitched. The interior was dim, obscured by shadows, but I could see movement inside. Two figures leaned out slightly, their hands gripping the frame. They shouted, though I couldn't make out the words at first, my mind focusing only on the urgency in the sound. "Get in. Now!" The voice broke through, sharp and commanding, and I realized they were addressing me. My chest constricted, adrenaline spiking. Every rational explanation I had offered, coincidence, delivery, mistaken identity dissolved into a visceral, gut-deep panic. They weren't joking. They weren't mistaken. They wanted me. I bolted instinctively, pivoting toward the side path, heart hammering, feet pounding against the pavement. The van accelerated in tandem, its engine growl growing louder, closer. My mind raced. I could hear them shouting again, distorted, menacing, trying to coax me, command me. Fear sharpened every sense, the screech of tires on asphalt, the rustle of leaves in the sudden gust, the sound of my own ragged breath. I darted into a narrow alley, hoping to obscure my silhouette, to create distance, to disappear from their view. The van followed. My heart leapt into my throat as I glimpsed one of the men leaning out, scanning, searching, eyes narrowing as if deciding whether I could be forced to comply. My pulse screamed, my mind screaming louder, run, don't stop, survive. The city around me blurred into a tunnel of shadows and streetlights, each step a calculated gamble. I passed an open shop door, briefly considering hiding inside, but my gut told me movement was my only chance. I risked the cross street, weaving through parked cars, the van mirroring my maneuvers like a predator honing in. I realized, terrifyingly, how isolated I was. The usual walkers and runners had gone. The park benches were empty. Even the distant hum of the city seemed to fade, leaving only me in the van and the echoing threat it carried. I was alone. Completely alone. Then, in a sudden, brief moment of clarity, I spotted a group of people gathered near the fountain in the public square up ahead. My lungs burned, legs screaming in protest, but I sprinted toward them, waving arms, shouting for help. The van hesitated, engine idling, as though assessing the new variables, and then, just for an instant, I thought I saw the figures inside exchange glances. I reached the crowd, panting, chest heaving, heart hammering. I didn't stop running until the van had turned the corner, still slowly, almost lazily, as if it had decided this particular attempt would end tonight. But the shadow of it lingered in my mind. Even surrounded by people, safe for the moment, I couldn't shake the cold awareness that they had chosen me. They had watched, waited, and then acted, testing boundaries, and I knew instinctively that it wasn't over. The van had disappeared into the night, but the memory of that sliding side door, the shouts, the intent in those men's eyes, it remained, vivid and alive, a threat that would not easily dissipate. I stood there, trembling, soaked in sweat and fear, realizing the truth I could no longer deny. The ordinary evening had transformed into something sinister, and my life had been touched by an abrupt, deliberate darkness. And I knew, deep down, that next time, they might not let me get away. The next morning, I couldn't shake the lingering terror. Every creak in my apartment, every faint whisper of wind against the windows, made my pulse jump. Rationally, I knew the van hadn't been waiting for me overnight, hadn't magically followed me home while I slept. But instinct and memory were stubborn, insistent, and I felt it in my bones. That van, those men, had marked me. I called my best friend, Sarah, hoping that just hearing a familiar voice might ease the lingering panic. Her tone was sympathetic but practical. "You're overreacting," she said. It was one van. One scary encounter. You're safe at home. Just don't go running in the dark tonight. I nodded, but the reassurance did nothing. I couldn't erase the image of the sliding door, the shout, the intent in their eyes. I replayed every detail, every moment of my flight, the growl of the engine, the scrape of the tires as they matched my path, the way one of them leaned just enough to measure me. There was no mistaking their intent. By the afternoon, I knew I had to be careful. I researched self-defense strategies, planning escape routes in my neighborhood, memorizing streets, alleyways, and public areas I could duck into if needed. Every corner, every cross street, every block became a calculation, a potential hazard or refuge. My routines had transformed into a mental map of safety and vulnerability. That evening, I decided to test my fear. I went for a short jog near my apartment, choosing a busy street instead of the Riverside Trail. Every sense was heightened, every shadow suspect, every passing vehicle a potential threat. My pace was brisk, my head constantly scanning. But there was no van. No man. Nothing except the ordinary sounds of the city. Relief washed over me briefly, but I knew it was fragile. The van had chosen when and how to act. Their timing was deliberate. My temporary safety didn't erase the certainty that it could happen again, anytime, anywhere. I finished the jog and returned home, shaken, but convinced that I had to remain vigilant. That night, sleep was impossible. Every distant car engine, every footstep outside my apartment made me tense. I double-checked locks, secured windows, and sat in the dark, listening. My imagination painted shadows moving outside, shapes shifting just beyond the lamplight, but the fear wasn't entirely imagined. The memory of their intent, their precise, patient aggression, lingered like a physical presence. Over the next few days, I noticed subtler signs. Cars lingering where they shouldn't, shadows that seemed to shift with intent, unfamiliar footsteps following the rhythm of my own. I realized with a sinking certainty that the van had not been an isolated event. Someone or multiple people were watching, learning my habits. Each time I left home, I felt the oppressive weight of eyes I couldn't see, calculating, waiting. One afternoon, I glimpsed a white van parked several blocks from my apartment. Its windows dark, engine off, doors closed. My stomach twisted. I wanted to convince myself it was coincidence, that the city had countless vehicles, that I was seeing patterns. But the dread that had taken root in my chest refused to be rationalized away. My hands shook, my vision narrowed, and my heart raced. I turned and fled in the opposite direction, weaving through streets, seeking crowds, anything that offered protection or witnesses. I ducked into a small convenience store, sweating, trembling, and kept watch from behind the shelves. The van didn't move. It remained parked, patient, silent, like a predator testing its patience, waiting for the right moment. By nightfall, I had decided I could no longer run blindly. Avoiding streets, relying on chance, or hoping the van wouldn't appear was not enough. I had to prepare. I stocked my apartment with small survival tools, a flashlight, a sturdy kitchen knife, and a charged phone at hand at all times. I memorized every escape route in the building, every emergency exit, every street I might flee down. I even considered keeping a bicycle inside for a rapid getaway. Despite these preparations, the terror remained. Each evening, the streets seemed narrower, the shadows darker, every passerby potentially a threat. I started timing my movements, watching for vehicles that lingered, noting license plates, registering unusual behavior. My paranoia was a survival mechanism, and it was working, but it came at a cost. Sleep was shallow, meals tasteless, my nerves taut at all hours. By the end of the week, the van's presence or the thought of it had become a constant companion. I walked, ran, and even rested under the oppressive awareness that I was being studied. Every pattern of my life had shifted subtly, dictated by a fear I couldn't shake, a van I could not escape in memory if not in reality. I knew with dreadful clarity that the encounter was no accident. They would return. And next time, I realized, I might not be able to escape. The days that followed were a tense exercise in vigilance. Every time I left my apartment, I felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking me, measuring me, calculating. The city seemed transformed, every street corner a potential trap, every parked car a threat. I avoided running at dusk, even in busy areas. I clung to well-lit streets and crowded sidewalks, my gaze scanning constantly for movement that didn't belong. Despite my caution, paranoia gnawed at the edges of my mind. I found myself double-checking reflections in store windows, glancing at license plates of vehicles that loitered too long, cataloging people on foot who lingered longer than they should. Every sound, a footstep, a rolling trash can, the scrape of a bicycle chain set my pulse racing. Sleep was shallow and fractured. I woke repeatedly, convinced I heard the low growl of an engine or the faint hiss of tires on pavement. 2 nights later, the van returned. I was walking home from a late shift at the cafe, carrying my bag over one shoulder, earbuds in. My pace quickened when I noticed a familiar shape behind a row of parked cars. White. Unmarked. Engine idling softly. The side door was already slightly open, a dark gap that swallowed the dim streetlight. My stomach twisted. My breath hitched. The thought of confronting it or fleeing raced in my mind, but I had no doubt they were waiting for me again. I considered running, but this time I hesitated. I had learned that blind panic was dangerous. Instead, I kept moving calmly, eyes fixed ahead, calculating my steps. The van mirrored me, shifting subtly, keeping pace. I could see one of the men leaning partially out of the door, scanning the sidewalk, eyes narrowed. Their patience was maddening. It was deliberate. They didn't need to rush. They could wait until the perfect moment. My legs burned as I ducked into a small side street, hoping to create distance or at least obscure myself from their view. The van followed, engine purring softly, tires whispering against asphalt. I realized then that I was being hunted with unnerving precision. Every evasive action I took was noted, measured. Every instinct I had to escape was anticipated. I ducked into a lit shop doorway, pressing my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I thought about calling the police, explaining the situation, but my fear held me back. How could I convey that I was being tracked by a van, by men who seemed to have anticipated every possible move? That it wasn't random, but an orchestrated pursuit? My trembling hands hovered over my phone, fingers shaking, until I realized it was already too late. The van had paused briefly, as if assessing my position, then silently retreated down the street. The relief was temporary. I knew they had chosen me, had tested their ability to corral me, and they would return. I made it home safely, but the apartment offered only the illusion of security. I double-checked locks, windows, doors, and sat on the couch, flashlight in hand, listening. Every outside sound made me flinch, the faint scrape of tires, the distant hum of engines, the rustle of leaves in the wind. The city itself seemed complicit, a stage for the terror that now dictated my movements. Over the next several days, I noticed patterns in my environment that I hadn't before, the white van appearing near intersections I frequented, parked at unusual angles, doors slightly ajar as if testing lines of sight. I started memorizing license plates, scanning every street I passed. The city became a puzzle of observation and evasion, each moment weighted with the threat that they might return at any time, and this time, they might be bolder. By the end of the week, my routines were entirely dictated by fear. I avoided jogging altogether, even in daylight. I took longer, busier streets home, checked shadows behind fences, behind parked cars, behind every corner. My world had narrowed into a web of calculation and vigilance. I carried my knife openly, flashlight at the ready, every step a potential escape or confrontation. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always near, always waiting. That their patience wasn't just strategy, it was a statement. They had chosen me. And I understood with chilling clarity that my life had already been touched by a deliberate, patient darkness. I knew that eventually, the van would return. And when it did, my chances of escape would depend on nothing but instinct, preparation, and luck. The thought made my stomach twist and my heart hammer. But deep down, I also understood the truth. It wasn't just a van. It wasn't just men. It was the realization that someone, somewhere, had marked me, and I had become prey. I had survived their first attempt. But survival, I knew, was fragile. And the night when I might not escape, when the patient, deliberate pursuit would reach its inevitable conclusion, was coming closer with each passing moment. I stopped leaving my apartment after sunset. Every shadow, every parked car, every flicker of a streetlight became a potential trap. My small sanctuary of walls and locks offered comfort, but I knew it was only temporary. The van could return any time, and I would be vulnerable. My fear had become a constant companion, gnawing at me even when the city seemed calm and empty. I began obsessively tracking all vehicles in the neighborhood. License plates, tire patterns, park positions, everything became data. My apartment had transformed into a command center of vigilance, maps on the walls, lists and notebooks, marked streets I considered safe or dangerous. My diet, sleep, and every moment outside were dictated by survival strategies. I had become a prisoner of fear. And then, one evening, it happened again. I had been careful, staying well-lit, moving only through populated streets. But a familiar engine growl reached me from behind a row of parked cars. My pulse surged, and I froze. The van emerged slowly, white, unmarked, the sliding door ominously half open. My stomach lurched. My heart thudded like a drum in my ears. I ducked instinctively into a side alley, the shadows wrapping around me. I dared a glance. Two men leaned slightly from the open door, scanning, observing, calculating. The longer I stared, the more precise their patience seemed. I realized then they had learned my behavior, my instincts, my route, my timing. Every choice I made to evade them had been anticipated, cataloged. Fear gave way to a cold, focused clarity. I had to move. My muscles coiled, and I ran. Down alleyways, around corners, across narrow streets. The van followed, its tires whispering against asphalt, engine purring. The men shouted for me to stop, their voices low and commanding, laced with an unrelenting insistence. Get in. Now! I recognized the threat for what it was, not just physical, but psychological, designed to break me, to instill terror before they even reached me. I bolted into a small public square, where a late-night cafe emitted light and muffled voices. I waved my arms, shouted for help, and for a moment, felt relief. The van slowed, then paused. The figures inside exchanged a glance, and I realized with a sinking certainty that they weren't deterred by witnesses. They were testing, gauging reactions, building a map of behavior. I didn't stop running until the van had disappeared around a corner. My chest heaved, lungs burning, sweat streaming down my face. The cafe patron stared at me, confused and alarmed. I offered a shaky explanation about a suspicious van and men shouting at me, but the words sounded hollow, inadequate to explain the depth of fear. Back in my apartment, I barricaded doors and windows more thoroughly than ever. I sat in darkness, listening to the city's faint sounds. Every creak, rustle, and distant engine made my pulse spike. I felt watched, measured, preyed upon even within my supposed safe haven. Sleep came only in brief, disjointed fits. In dreams, the van appeared silently behind corners, doors sliding open without warning, figures leaning from the opening with precise intent. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I could still hear the faint growl of tires against asphalt. Over the next few days, I studied news reports, searching for similar incidents, abductions, attempted kidnappings, reports of unmarked vans targeting joggers. Nothing directly matched. It reinforced the terror. These men were invisible in a city of millions. They could strike anywhere, anytime, and leave no trace. I realized survival required preparation beyond vigilance. I stocked my apartment with defensive tools, emergency supplies, and charged my phone constantly. Every exit route became a mental map, every street a calculated risk. I began to imagine worst-case scenarios, being cornered, overpowered, dragged into that van. The possibility of capture lurked in every shadow, every quiet street. I had survived their previous attempts. But each encounter, each sighting, taught me a harsh truth: the van would return. They were patient, methodical, deliberate. My choices could delay them, mislead them, or offer temporary reprieve, but I knew instinctively that the pursuit was inevitable. And when it came, I would need more than speed and caution. I would need strategy, courage, and an unshakable will to survive. By the end of that week, I understood something chilling. The van wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. It was predatory. And I was the prey. The night it returned, I knew this encounter would not end with mere fear. I had prepared as best I could, knives within reach, flashlight in hand, phone fully charged, doors and windows locked and reinforced. Every muscle was tense, every nerve alert. My apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a fortress, but I understood that even walls and locks might not be enough. I heard it before I saw it, the low hum of an engine, familiar and menacing, rolling along the street outside. My heart pounded, throat dry. I peered through the blinds, my pulse hammering against my temples. There it was, white, unmarked, side door sliding open silently, two figures leaning out just enough to make their presence unmistakable. The growl of the engine, the soft shuffle of tires, was like a predator marking territory. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself of what I had learned: patience, observation, preparation. The van was deliberate, but not infallible. They had tested me before. Now it was time for a final assessment. My hands gripped the knife tightly, my eyes scanning for escape routes, any advantage. The van stopped at the curb, engine idling. The men shouted, their voices low and commanding, insistent, "Get in. Now!" I froze, realizing that this was the point of no return. My mind raced: fight, flee, negotiate. Survival instinct screamed at me to act, to move, to resist. I stepped back, assessing the narrow alley behind me as a potential escape. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, one of the figures leaned further, emerging partially from the sliding door, eyes locked on mine. The sheer patience, the calculated intensity of his gaze, was suffocating. I realized the encounter was more than physical. It was psychological, a test of my composure, my will to survive. I made my move. Sprinting down the alley, I zigzagged past dumpsters, trash cans, and fences, adrenaline coursing through every vein. The van followed, tires whispering on the asphalt, engine growling. I could hear the shouts behind me, distorted, echoing off buildings. My lungs burned, legs screamed in protest, but I forced myself onward. I reached the main street, where the faint glow of a late-night diner promised witnesses. I slammed open the door, yelling for help, knocking over a signpost in my panic. Patrons and staff turned, startled, and I grabbed a waiter's attention. "Call the police." "White van. 2 men, they're trying to get me." My words tumbled over each other, frantic, disjointed, but the message was clear. The van hesitated at the curb, engine idling. I could see the figures inside, eyes scanning, measuring, deciding. And then, as if the presence of witnesses altered their calculation, it reversed slowly, disappearing into the night. Relief surged, but I knew it was temporary. They had been patient, deliberate, and nothing guaranteed they wouldn't return when the streets were empty again. The police arrived moments later. I described the van, the men, their actions. Officers took notes, promised patrols, reassured me as best they could. But the reassurance felt fragile, inadequate. I knew the truth. My survival tonight was circumstantial, dependent on witnesses and light. Alone, I would still be prey, In the days that followed, I moved with heightened vigilance. I avoided running, walked only in well-populated areas, and relied on a network of friends and family for accompaniment whenever possible. My routines, once casual and predictable, became strategic. Every street, every corner, every vehicle was assessed for threat. The fear persisted, but now it was accompanied by purpose, a plan to survive, to remain unpredictable, to stay one step ahead. Months later, the van never appeared again. At least, not in the same way. The city returned to its mundane rhythms, the streets noisy and busy, the nights alive with distant traffic and voices. I resumed jogging slowly, cautiously, always alert. The memory of those nights, the sliding door, the shouts, and the men's patient gaze remained vivid, a permanent scar etched into my awareness. I survived. I escaped the immediate danger. The van, the men, and their intent had not succeeded in abducting me. But I was changed. Every shadow, every vehicle, every stranger reminded me of that night, of the calculated, patient predation that had sought to claim me. And I understood the truth that stayed with me. Survival was not mere luck, it was vigilance, preparation, and the unwillingness to surrender to fear. The van had come close. Too close. And though it had left, the lessons remained. I was alive, cautious, and unbroken. But the city had shown me its darker edge, and I would never forget.